In 1849, a young British archaeologist named Austin Henry Layard was excavating the ancient Assyrian city of Nineveh, located in what is now northern Iraq, when his workers uncovered something extraordinary. Buried beneath the ruins of the palace of King Ashurbanipal lay thousands of clay tablets, carefully preserved in what appeared to be the royal library. Among these tablets, inscribed in the wedge-shaped cuneiform script of ancient Mesopotamia, were stories that would fundamentally challenge Victorian understanding of biblical uniqueness. 23 years later, in 1872, a young assistant at the British Museum named George Smith was cataloguing and translating these tablets when he came across a passage that made him so excited, he reportedly began removing his clothing in the workroom. Smith had discovered an ancient Mesopotamian account of a great flood that predated the biblical narrative by more than 1,000 years. The tablet described a man who survived a divinely sent deluge by building a massive boat and preserving animal life. The parallels to the story of Noah were unmistakable, yet this version came from a civilization that flourished long before the Hebrew Bible was written. The implications were staggering. For centuries, the flood story had been considered a unique Hebrew narrative, a divinely inspired account without precedent in human literature. Now, physical evidence existed that similar stories had circulated throughout ancient Mesopotamia for millennia. What Smith had discovered was Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest known work of literature. But this was only the beginning. As scholars continued translating cuneiform tablets from various Mesopotamian cities, they uncovered multiple versions of the flood narrative, each providing different details and perspectives. The Atrahasis Epic, the Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian King List, all contained accounts of a catastrophic deluge that destroyed humanity, with only select survivors preserved through divine intervention. These texts weren't copies of each other, but represented an evolving tradition of flood storytelling that stretched back to the very origins of written language itself. The question that emerged from these discoveries was profound. Why did ancient Mesopotamian civilization preserve such consistent accounts of a great flood across thousands of years and multiple cultures? Were these stories purely mythological, or did they preserve memories of actual catastrophic events that shaped early human civilization? The cuneiform tablets themselves provide our most direct window into how the ancient Mesopotamians understood their own past, and what they tell us reveals a sophisticated literary tradition grappling with questions of divine justice, human survival, and the relationship between gods and mortals. The most complete version of the Mesopotamian flood story comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh, specifically the 11th tablet of the standard Babylonian version compiled during the reign of the Kassite dynasty, around 1300 BC. This tablet contains the account of Utnapishtim, a man who achieved immortality after surviving the great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. The narrative framework places this story within Gilgamesh's quest for eternal life. The hero king of Uruk travels to the ends of the earth seeking Utnapishtim, the only mortal ever granted immortality by the gods, hoping to learn the secret of eternal life. What follows is Utnapishtim's detailed first-person account of the flood, told to Gilgamesh as an explanation of how he gained his immortal status. The tablet itself, catalogued as K3375 in the British Museum collection, measures approximately 15 centimetres in height and contains 226 lines of cuneiform text written in the Akkadian language. The tablet was discovered among the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh during Austin Henry Layard's excavations in the mid-19th century, though it would be decades before George Smith successfully translated its contents. The physical condition of the tablet posed significant challenges for translation. Portions of the text were damaged or missing, leading Smith to organise a follow-up expedition to Nineveh in 1873, specifically to search for missing fragments. Remarkably, within 5 days of beginning excavations, Smith's team discovered an additional fragment that filled one of the critical gaps in the narrative. The literary structure of Tablet 11 demonstrates sophisticated narrative technique. The entire Epic of Gilgamesh comprises 12 tablets totaling approximately 3,000 lines of poetry, with the 11th tablet devoted entirely to the flood story. This placement is significant. It occurs near the climax of Gilgamesh's journey. After he has overcome numerous obstacles to reach Utnapishtim's dwelling at the edge of the world, the hero arrives exhausted and desperate, seeking the secret of eternal life after the death of his beloved friend Enkidu has forced him to confront his own mortality. Utnapishtim's response to Gilgamesh's request is to tell his story, demonstrating that immortality was not something achieved through heroic action, but rather was a unique gift from the gods in response to extraordinary circumstances that would never be repeated. The narrative voice shifts dramatically when Utnapishtim begins his account. The text transitions from third-person narration to Utnapishtim's first-person testimony, creating an intimate eyewitness quality. He describes how he lived in the city of Shuruppak, an ancient settlement on the banks of the Euphrates River, and served as king during a time when the gods had decided to destroy humanity. The reason for this divine decision remains somewhat ambiguous in the Gilgamesh version. The text suggests that humanity had become too numerous and noisy, disturbing the gods' rest, though this explanation seems insufficient for such drastic action. What becomes clear is that Enlil, the chief god of the Mesopotamian pantheon, had convinced the divine council to send a flood that would obliterate all human life. The god Ea, however, had different intentions. Ea, whose name means "zero" in Sumerian, where he was known as Enki, served as the god of wisdom, fresh water, and magic. He had played a central role in creating humanity according to Mesopotamian tradition, and felt protective toward his creation. Unable to directly oppose Enlil's decree, Ea devised a clever workaround. He appeared to Utnapishtim not directly, but by speaking to the reed wall of his house, ostensibly addressing the structure itself rather than the man inside. This technical compliance with divine law while subverting its intent demonstrates the complexity of Mesopotamian theological thought, where even gods operated within systems of rules and hierarchies. The instructions Ea provided to Utnapishtim were extensive and specific, covering not just the construction of the survival vessel, but also how Utnapishtim should explain his actions to his fellow citizens. He told him to tell the people of Shuruppak that Enlil had rejected him, and that he could no longer live in the city or walk on Enlil's territory. He should say he was going to the Apsu, the underground freshwater ocean that was Ea's domain, where he would build a dwelling. The text preserves a darkly ironic prophecy that Ea instructed Utnapishtim to deliver. On you he will rain down abundance, the choicest birds, the rarest fish. The land will have its fill of harvest riches. This prediction was literally true. The rain would indeed come in abundance, but the citizens of Shuruppak would interpret it as a blessing rather than the warning it actually represented. The literary sophistication of this passage reveals much about the composition of the epic. The double meaning, the dramatic irony of the citizens helping build the boat while misunderstanding their own fate, and the ethical complexity of Utnapishtim's necessary deception, all demonstrate that this was not a simple morality tale, but a nuanced exploration of survival, responsibility, and the relationship between humans and gods. The text forces readers to consider difficult questions. Was Utnapishtim justified in deceiving his neighbours? Should Ea have found a way to warn others? What responsibility did Utnapishtim bear for the deaths of everyone he knew? The epic offers no simple answers, instead presenting the situation as a tragic necessity. Utnapishtim's account includes remarkably specific technical details about the construction of the vessel that would preserve life through the deluge. The god Ea, also known as Enki, appeared to Utnapishtim in a dream and warned him of the coming flood, instructing him to abandon his possessions and build a boat to preserve life. The specifications Ea provided were precise. The boat should be cube-shaped, with each dimension measuring 120 cubits, approximately 60 meters on each side. The vessel was to have 6 decks, dividing the interior into 7 levels, with 9 compartments on each level, creating a total of 63 separate chambers within the massive structure. The construction materials Ea specified included substantial quantities of timber, rope, and bitumen. Utnapishtim describes mobilizing the entire city of Shuruppak to assist with construction, though they remained ignorant of the vessel's true purpose. He brought craftsmen to cut timber, children to carry bitumen, and the poor to transport the necessary materials. The text provides specific quantities. He poured 3,600 measures of bitumen into a furnace and used another 3,600 measures of pitch. The workers consumed 3,600 measures of oil during construction. Utnapishtim slaughtered oxen and sheep daily to feed the labourers and provided beer, red wine, white wine, and oil as if it were river water, enabling the workers to feast as on New Year's Day. The geometric form of the vessel, a cube rather than a conventional boat shape, has puzzled scholars for over a century. From a practical maritime perspective, a cube would be extremely unstable in water, prone to rolling, and virtually impossible to steer. Modern naval architects have confirmed that such a vessel would function poorly as a boat in any conventional sense. This has led many scholars to conclude that the cubic form was symbolically significant rather than practically optimal. In Mesopotamian cosmology, the cube represented perfection and cosmic order. The most sacred room in Mesopotamian temples, the cellar where the god's statue resided, was typically cubic. The cosmic city, the ideal form of human habitation, was often described as square or cubic in ancient Near Eastern thought. The construction timeline Utnapishtim describes was remarkably brief. He states that the boat was completed in 7 days, with the launching occurring on the 7th day. This compressed timeline seems implausible for such an enormous vessel, suggesting either that the numbers carry symbolic rather than literal meaning, or that the account assumes a workforce of extraordinary size and efficiency working around the clock. The number 7 held particular significance in Mesopotamian thought, representing completeness and divine perfection. The 7-day construction period may have been intended to parallel the 7-day creation accounts found in other Mesopotamian texts. The launching of the vessel presented considerable engineering challenges. Utnapishtim describes how 2/3 of the structure remained above the waterline even when fully loaded, requiring approximately 3,600 measures of oil to be poured beneath the boat to reduce friction and enable it to slide into the river. This detail, along with the extensive use of bitumen for waterproofing, demonstrates practical knowledge of shipbuilding techniques. Bitumen, a naturally occurring petroleum substance that seeps from the ground in various locations in Mesopotamia, was widely used in ancient construction for waterproofing and as mortar. Archaeological excavations throughout Mesopotamia have confirmed the extensive use of bitumen in construction, particularly for waterproofing foundations and lining water channels. Once the vessel was completed and launched, Utnapishtim describes loading it with cargo that went far beyond simple survival provisions. He brought aboard all his silver and gold, all his living creatures and family, craftsmen of every kind, and wild animals of the field. The inclusion of precious metals and craftsmen reveals the scope of what Utnapishtim was attempting to preserve, not just biological survival, but the preservation of civilization itself, including wealth, skilled knowledge, and the means to rebuild complex society after the catastrophe. The text specifies that he brought aboard animals of the steppe, though it does not enumerate species or provide the detailed counting found in later biblical versions. The loading process culminated with Utnapishtim's entry into the vessel, accompanied by his family. He describes how Shamash, the sun god, provided the final signal for sealing the boat. When Shamash announced that the leader of the storm would release a devastating rain at evening time, Utnapishtim should enter the boat and seal the door. This he did, entrusting the enormous structure with all its contents to Puzuramuri the boatman, who would presumably help manage the vessel during the flood. The sealing of the door marked the point of no return. Once inside the waterproofed cubic vessel, Utnapishtim and his companions would have no way to see outside, no ability to navigate, and no knowledge of when or whether they would ever emerge again. They would be entirely dependent on divine protection and the structural integrity of their unusual craft. While the Gilgamesh flood narrative is the most complete version we possess, it is not the oldest. The Atrahasis Epic, preserved on tablets dating to the Old Babylonian period around 1700 BC, contains an earlier version of the flood story that provides crucial context missing from the Gilgamesh account. The Atrahasis begins not with the flood itself, but with the creation of humanity and the circumstances that led the gods to decide on human destruction. According to this epic, humanity was created to serve the gods by performing agricultural labour and maintaining irrigation systems, relieving the lesser gods of this burdensome work. The Atrahasis Epic, whose name means exceedingly wise, survives in multiple fragmentary copies, discovered at various sites including Sippar, Babylon, and Nineveh. The most complete version was published by Wilfrid Lambert and Alan Millard in 1969, based primarily on tablets excavated from the temple library at Sippar during the late 19th century. The epic comprises 3 tablets totaling approximately 1,200 lines of poetry, though substantial portions remain lost or damaged. Unlike the Gilgamesh version, where the flood story appears as an embedded narrative within a larger heroic epic, the Atrahasis presents the flood as the climax of a coherent theological narrative about divine-human relations. The epic begins in primordial times when the senior gods, the Anunnaki, forced the lesser gods, the Igigi, to perform all the labour necessary to maintain the world. For 40 years the Igigi dug rivers, excavated canals, and performed agricultural work while the senior gods enjoyed leisure. This arrangement proved unsustainable. The Igigi eventually rebelled, burning their tools and marching to confront Enlil at his temple in Nippur. The text describes their revolt vividly. They set fire to their tools, they put fire to their spades and set flames to their baskets. The labour strike of the gods created a crisis that threatened cosmic order itself. In response to this divine labour dispute, the god Enki proposed a solution: create a new class of beings who would perform the necessary work, freeing both senior and junior gods from toil. The goddess Beletili, also known as Mami or Nintu, was tasked with creating these new workers, humanity. The creation process described in Atrahasis involves sophisticated conceptualization. Beletili mixed clay with the blood of a slain god, specifically Wiile, described as a god who had rationality. This divine blood provided humanity with intelligence and consciousness, while the clay provided physical form. 14 pieces of this mixture were created, 7 male and 7 female, and from these the human population grew. For a time, this arrangement worked well. Humanity multiplied and performed the agricultural labour the gods required. However, as the human population grew larger and denser, a new problem emerged. The text states that 1,200 years had not yet passed when the land extended and the peoples multiplied. The land was bellowing like a bull. The god got disturbed with their uproar. Enlil heard their noise and addressed the great gods. The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar, I am deprived of sleep. This passage reveals a recurring divine complaint that appears in multiple versions of the flood story. Humanity's noise disturbs divine rest. Enlil's response to the noise problem was to attempt population reduction through various catastrophes. First, he sent plague, then he sent drought and famine, each time attempting to reduce human numbers to a tolerable level. Each time, however, Enki intervened to help humanity survive. When plague struck, Enki instructed the sage Atrahasis to have humanity cease worshipping other gods and focus all offerings on Namtar, the god of plague, who would then relent. When drought came, Enki similarly advised focusing worship on Adad, the storm god, who would bring rain. These cycles of divine assault and human survival through Enki's guidance occurred repeatedly over hundreds of years. Eventually Enlil became frustrated with these half-measures and the persistent intervention of Enki. He convened the divine council and proposed a final solution, a flood that would destroy humanity completely and permanently. This time Enlil made the other gods swear an oath not to reveal the plan to humanity. Enki, bound by this oath yet unwilling to allow total human destruction, employed the same clever workaround that appears in the Gilgamesh version. He spoke to the wall of Atrahasis' reed house, ostensibly addressing the structure, while ensuring the human inside could hear, "Reed wall, 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 reed wall, listen, wall, pay attention, man of Shurapak, son of Ubatutu, demolish the house, build a boat, reject possessions and save life." The Atrahasis version provides more extensive detail about the social and theological context of the flood than Gilgamesh does. The epic presents the flood not as an arbitrary divine action, but as the culmination of a long-running conflict between Enlil's desire for peace and quiet versus Enki's protective relationship with humanity. The creation of humans from divine blood establishes kinship between gods and humans that makes complete destruction problematic. Enki's repeated interventions demonstrate that at least some gods valued human life and recognized humanity's right to exist, even if that existence created inconvenience for the divine realm. The text also explores the ethical implications of creating beings for the purpose of labor, then destroying them when they become successful enough to be bothersome. The boat construction details in Atrahasis differ somewhat from those in Gilgamesh. The vessel is described as circular rather than cubic, with a roof that meets at the centre like the apsu, suggesting a round, domed structure. The dimensions are given as 120 cubits in each direction for the base, with walls 120 cubits high, again suggesting a cube or rectangular structure despite the reference to circular form. These apparent contradictions have led scholars to conclude that either the text suffered corruption during transmission, or that the architectural descriptions were meant to be understood symbolically rather than as precise engineering specifications. The reference to the Apsu, Enki's underwater freshwater domain, reinforces the association of the flood vessel with Enki's protection and the life-giving properties of fresh water. Even older than the Atrahasis is the Eridu Genesis, a fragmentary Sumerian text that represents the earliest known written version of the flood narrative. Discovered among the tablet collections from Nippur and dating to approximately 1600 BC in its preserved form, though clearly based on much older oral traditions, this text introduces us to Ziusudra, the Sumerian equivalent of Utnapishtim. The Eridu Genesis is frustratingly incomplete. Large sections of the tablet are missing or illegible, but what remains provides crucial insights into how the Sumerians themselves understood this foundational story. The Eridu Genesis takes its name from the ancient Sumerian city of Eridu, considered in Mesopotamian tradition to be the first city ever built and the original seat of kingship. According to Sumerian cosmology, Eridu was where civilization began, founded by the god Enki who dwelt in the Apsu beneath the city. The text begins with a creation narrative that has largely been lost, then describes the establishment of 5 cities: Eridu, Bat-Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shurupak, each founded by different deities, and each with its own sacred function within the organization of early Sumerian civilization. The preserved text describes how kingship was lowered from heaven to these cities, and how the god Nintor, the mother goddess, created humanity to serve the gods and maintain the irrigation systems that made civilization possible in the arid Mesopotamian climate. The text then breaks off, with approximately 150 lines missing from the tablet. When the narrative resumes, it is in the midst of describing a divine decision to destroy humanity through flood. The reasons for this decision are not preserved in the surviving text, leaving us to speculate based on parallels with later versions whether noise, overpopulation, or some other factor motivated the divine council. The hero of the Eridu Genesis is Ziusudra, whose name in Sumerian can be translated as Life of Long Days, or He Found Life. He's described as a pious king who stands in reverent attendance before the gods. The text describes how he stood by a wall where he received divine revelation, the same narrative device found in later Akkadian versions. Through this wall, the god Enki warns Ziusudra of the coming flood, though the actual warning text is among the missing portions of the tablet. What survives is Enki's instruction to build a large boat, with fragmentary references to dimensions that are no longer fully legible. The flood itself is described with vivid intensity in the surviving portions of text. Quote 10, the text specifies that the flood lasted 7 days and 7 nights, during which quote 11. This 7-day duration matches neither the Gilgamesh account, which describes 6 days and 7 nights, nor the biblical version's 40 days, suggesting independent transmission of the tradition, or symbolic rather than literal timekeeping. After the 7 days, the text describes the sun god Utu emerging and bringing light back to heaven and earth. Ziusudra opens a window in his boat and prostrates himself before Utu, then performs sacrifices of oxen and sheep. At this point the tablet is badly damaged again, but when the text resumes it describes Ziusudra receiving immortality as a reward for preserving life. The gods An and Enlil give Ziusudra life like a god and eternal breath like a god, then settle him in Dilmun, the place where the sun rises, a paradisiacal location at the edge of the world. This conclusion parallels the ending of the Gilgamesh flood narrative, where Utnapishtim similarly receives immortality and is settled in a distant location. What makes the Eridu Genesis particularly significant for understanding Mesopotamian flood traditions is its Sumerian language and clear connection to the oldest stratum of Mesopotamian culture. While the Gilgamesh and Atrahasis epics were composed in Akkadian, the language of the Semitic people who came to dominate Mesopotamia in the 2nd millennium BC, the Eridu Genesis preserves the flood story in Sumerian, the language isolate spoken by the culture that invented writing and created the first city-states in southern Mesopotamia. This linguistic evidence suggests that the flood narrative was part of Sumerian culture from its earliest literate period, not a story borrowed from elsewhere. The association with Eridu is itself significant. Archaeological excavations at the site, conducted by Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar in the 1946 through 1949 seasons, revealed that Eridu had indeed been one of the oldest continuously inhabited sites in southern Mesopotamia, with settlement layers dating back to approximately 5400 BC. The deepest levels of the site contained evidence of a temple to Enki that was rebuilt multiple times, each new structure constructed directly over the ruins of the previous one, maintaining sacred continuity across thousands of years. The 17 successive temple levels discovered at Eridu demonstrate the site's extraordinary antiquity and religious importance, supporting its mythological status as the first city. One of the most enigmatic documents from ancient Mesopotamia is the Sumerian king list, a chronological compilation of rulers that divides Mesopotamian history into 2 distinct periods, before the flood and after the flood. The document, preserved in multiple copies with the most complete version housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, states matter-of-factly that quote 15, and then continues listing kings who ruled afterward. What makes this document particularly intriguing is its treatment of antediluvian kings who are credited with impossibly long reigns. The Sumerian king list exists in over a dozen different versions, inscribed on clay tablets and prisms at various periods between approximately 2100 BC and 1600 BC. The most complete version is the Weld Blundell prism, a clay 4-sided prism discovered in Lhasa by archaeologist Herbert Weld Blundell in 1922 and subsequently acquired by the Ashmolean Museum. This prism contains the entirety of the list, beginning with the formulaic statement, quote 16. This opening establishes the theological framework. Kingship is not a human invention, but a divine gift lowered from heaven to earth. The list proceeds to enumerate the kings of Eridu, beginning with Alulim, who reigned for 28,800 years. The second king of Eridu, Alalga, ruled for 36,000 years. The list continues through 8 antediluvian kings ruling from 5 cities: Eridu, Bad-Tibir, Larak, Sippar, and Shurupak, each credited with reigns measuring in the thousands or tens of thousands of years. The total duration of these antediluvian reigns amounts to 241,200 years, a figure that clearly cannot be understood literally but demands interpretation. Following the enumeration of antediluvian kings, the text contains a simple but momentous statement. Quote 17. No further explanation or elaboration is provided. The flood is presented as an established historical fact requiring no justification or description. After this brief notice, the list resumes with the post-Diluvian period. Quote 18. The city has changed from Shurupak to Kish, and the dynasty has changed, but the institution of kingship continues, once again lowered from heaven. The post-Diluvian kings in the list are credited with much shorter reigns. Though still extraordinary by modern standards, Gaur of Kish ruled 1,200 years, while his successor, Gula-Nidaba Anapad, ruled 960 years. As the list progresses through successive dynasties, reign lengths gradually decrease, approaching historically plausible durations by the time it reaches kings of the early dynastic period, whose existence can be verified through archaeological evidence. This gradual normalization of reign lengths has led scholars to propose various interpretations of the antediluvian figures. Several scholarly theories attempt to explain the extraordinary antediluvian reign lengths. One interpretation suggests these figures represent dynasties rather than individual kings, with each name denoting a ruling house that persisted for the stated duration. Another theory proposes that the years were calculated using a different system, perhaps months or seasons rather than solar years, though this would require assuming the Sumerians used inconsistent chronological methods within the same document. A third interpretation views the numbers as purely symbolic, with larger figures indicating greater antiquity and divine proximity rather than actual temporal duration. The mathematical structure of the antediluvian reign lengths reveals interesting patterns. The numbers are consistently divisible by 3,600, a number the Sumerians called a sar and which held special significance in their mathematical and astronomical systems. Alulim's reign of 28,800 years equals 8 sars. Alalgar's 36,000 years equals 10 sars. This consistent use of sars suggests the numbers were calculated according to a deliberate system, rather than being arbitrary legendary exaggerations. The sar itself represented the square of 60. The base of the Sumerian sexagesimal counting system that gave us the 60-minute hour and the 360-degree circle. The cities listed as seats of antediluvian kingship correspond to real archaeological sites that rank among the oldest urban settlements in Mesopotamia. Eridu, as previously mentioned, has yielded evidence of occupation dating to the late 6th millennium BC. Excavations at Shurupak, conducted between 1930s and 1960s, revealed a major Sumerian city that flourished during the early dynastic period. At Shurupak, archaeologists discovered evidence of a significant flood layer dating to approximately 2900 BC, though whether this local flooding had any connection to the literary flood tradition remains debated. The king list's treatment of the flood as a historical dividing point that nonetheless did not end kingship or civilization demonstrates the Mesopotamian understanding of catastrophic events as cyclical rather than unique. The flood was devastating enough to mark a clear break in dynastic succession and to require kingship to be lowered from heaven again, yet it was not so complete that civilization needed to be entirely reinvented. This perspective differs from later biblical interpretation, which treats the flood as a unique event that will never be repeated. The Mesopotamian view allowed for the possibility of recurring catastrophes that periodically reset human civilization while permitting its eventual re-emergence. When the three main flood narratives, the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis Epic, and Tablet 11 of Gilgamesh, are examined side by side, striking consistencies emerge that suggest a common historical or cultural memory underlying all three versions. Despite being separated by centuries and written in different languages, Sumerian and Akkadian, these texts agree on fundamental narrative elements. In all versions, a single pious man is warned by a friendly deity about an impending flood sent by the divine council to destroy humanity. The structural parallels between these narratives extend far beyond general plot similarity to include specific sequential details that appear in identical order across all three versions. Each account begins with the divine decision to destroy humanity, followed by the warning to the flood hero delivered through indirect means to circumvent divine prohibition. The hero then receives detailed instructions for boat construction, gathers his family and various forms of life, endures the flood, sends out birds to test for dry land, makes offerings upon emerging, and receives divine blessing. This narrative sequence remains stable across hundreds of years of textual transmission and cultural translation from Sumerian to Akkadian. The characterization of the flood hero maintains remarkable consistency, despite different names in different versions. Whether called Ziusudra in Sumerian, Atrahasis in Old Babylonian, or Utnapishtim in the standard Babylonian Gilgamesh, the hero is invariably portrayed as exceptionally pious, devoted to the gods, and specifically favoured by the deity of wisdom. The texts describe him as a king or leader of his community, though not necessarily the supreme ruler of all Sumer. His piety is contrasted implicitly with the general population's behaviour, though interestingly none of the versions describe specific human sins or transgressions that justify the flood. The destruction appears motivated by divine frustration with humanity in general rather than response to particular moral failings. The boat construction details show both consistencies and variations that illuminate the transmission process. All versions agree that the vessel was large, waterproofed with bitumen, equipped with multiple decks or levels, and contained compartments for separating different cargo. The Gilgamesh version specifies cubic dimensions of 120 cubits. The Atrahasis describes a circular or square base with similar dimensions, while the Eridu Genesis fragments are too damaged to preserve complete measurements. These variations suggest that while the essential concept of an unusually shaped multi-level vessel remained stable, specific technical details were less rigidly transmitted, perhaps because scribes recognized them as symbolic rather than literal. The cargo loaded onto the vessel maintained striking consistency across versions. All texts specify that the hero brought his family, though the exact extent of family varies. Some mention wife and children, others include extended family and servants. All versions include craftsmen or skilled workers. Recognizing that rebuilding civilization would require more than biological survival, but also preservation of technical knowledge. The inclusion of precious metals in multiple accounts demonstrates understanding that wealth would be necessary for reconstruction. Most significantly, all versions emphasize preservation of animal life, both domesticated and wild, though without the precise enumeration of species that appears in the later biblical account. The duration of the flood shows interesting variation that may reflect different chronological traditions or symbolic systems. The Eridu Genesis specifies 7 days and 7 nights. The Gilgamesh account describes 6 days and 7 nights of storm followed by additional time for waters to recede, while the Atrahasis fragments preserve references to 7 days but in damaged context. The prominence of 7-day periods reflects the sacred significance of this number in Mesopotamian thought, where 7 represented completeness and divine perfection. The slight variations between 6 and 7 days for the storm duration may reflect different scribal traditions or intentional modification to fit different theological frameworks. The bird-sending episode appears in all preserved versions with remarkable detail consistency. The sequence involves releasing multiple birds to test whether dry land has appeared, with early birds returning because they find no resting place, while the final bird does not return, indicating that land is available. The Gilgamesh version specifies 3 birds, dove, swallow and raven, released in sequence, a detail that would be replicated almost exactly in the biblical account written centuries later. This specific 3-bird sequence appearing across independent textual traditions suggests it represented an established canonical element of the flood narrative. The offering of sacrifice upon emerging from the vessel appears universally in all flood versions, though the specific details of the sacrifice vary. The hero consistently makes offerings on a mountain peak, using sweet-smelling woods and aromatics that produce pleasing smoke. The divine response to these sacrifices varies in detail, but maintains a consistent theme. The gods, having experienced the deprivation of human offerings during the flood, respond enthusiastically to the renewed sacrifices, described in the memorable Gilgamesh phrase as gathering _quote_19 around the offering. This anthropomorphic portrayal of divine need for human worship reveals sophisticated theological thought about interdependence between divine and human realms. The granting of immortality to the flood hero appears in both the Gilgamesh and Eridu Genesis versions, though the Atrahasis account breaks off before reaching this conclusion. In both preserved versions, the hero and his wife receive eternal life and are settled in a distant paradisiacal location at the edge of the world, described as the mouth of the rivers or Dilmun where the sun rises. This immortality is explicitly presented as unique and unrepeatable, a special divine gift in response to extraordinary circumstances that will never recur. The finality of this gift serves narrative purposes in Gilgamesh, where it explains to the hero king why his quest for immortality must fail. The only mortal who achieved eternal life did so through circumstances that cannot be duplicated. The theological framework underlying all versions maintains essential consistency despite surface variations. The gods operate as a council rather than a single supreme deity, with decisions made through deliberation and debate rather than unilateral divine fiat. This council structure allows for divine disagreement and conflict, with some gods advocating for humanity's preservation, while others demand destruction. The existence of this divine conflict creates narrative tension and moral complexity. The flood is not simply divine justice, but represents one faction's victory over another, in an ongoing debate about humanity's value and proper relationship to the divine realm. Across all versions of the Mesopotamian flood narrative, one deity consistently appears as humanity's advocate and protector. Ea in Akkadian sources, Enki in Sumerian texts. This god of wisdom, fresh water, and magic stands in opposition to the decision of the divine council to destroy humanity, and takes action to ensure survival by warning the flood hero. The characterization of Ea/Enki reveals much about Mesopotamian theological concepts and the relationship between gods and humans. Enki's name in Sumerian translates as Lord of the Earth or Lord of the Ground, though paradoxically his primary domain was not Earth, but the Apsu, the subterranean ocean of fresh water that the Mesopotamians believed existed beneath the surface of the Earth. This freshwater ocean fed springs, wells, and rivers, making it the ultimate source of agricultural fertility and thus of life itself. Enki's temple in Eridu was built directly over freshwater springs, and rituals conducted there emphasized the god's control over these life-giving waters. The association between Enki and freshwater made him fundamentally a god of fertility, abundance, and the sustenance of life. Beyond his aquatic associations, Enki served as the god of wisdom, magic, and esoteric knowledge. Mesopotamian texts credit him with creating the arts of civilization: writing, mathematics, metallurgy, construction, and magic. The Sumerian composition Enki and the World Order describes how Enki travelled throughout the world establishing the fundamental principles of civilization, from agriculture and animal husbandry to prostitution and political governance. In this role, Enki functioned as a culture hero deity who bridged the gap between divine and human realms by sharing knowledge and skills that elevated humanity from primitive existence to civilized life. Enki's relationship to humanity was intimate and protective in ways that distinguished him from other major Mesopotamian deities. According to the Atrahasis Epic, Enki played the central role in humanity's creation, proposing the solution to the gods' labour problems and supervising the mixing of clay with divine blood that produced human beings. This creative involvement gave Enki a proprietary interest in humanity's survival and flourishing. Where other gods might view humans as useful servants or annoying noisemakers, Enki saw his own handiwork, beings that carried divine intelligence through the sacrifice god's blood mixed into their very substance. The characterization of Enki as clever and cunning appears throughout Mesopotamian literature. He repeatedly solves problems through wit and deception rather than force, using his superior intelligence to outmaneuver other gods while technically remaining within divine law. In the flood narratives, this cleverness manifests in his method of warning the flood hero while avoiding direct violation of his oath to the divine council. By speaking to the wall of the hero's reed house rather than to the man himself, Enki maintains the letter of his oath while completely subverting its intent. This legalistic cleverness characterizes Enki as a trickster figure who uses superior intelligence to achieve goals that direct action could not accomplish. Enki's opposition to the flood decision appears motivated by multiple factors that the texts portray with nuance. Most obviously, as humanity's creator, he feels protective toward his creation and reluctant to see it destroyed. The Atrahasis Epic emphasizes this motivation, showing Enki's repeated interventions to help humanity survive earlier divine attempts at population control through plague and drought. Beyond simple protectiveness, Enki appears to value the principle that problems should be solved through wisdom rather than destruction. His alternative suggestions for controlling human population, reducing fertility, introducing natural mortality, establishing predators, demonstrate his preference for balanced solutions over catastrophic intervention. The text also suggests that Enki recognizes humanity's value to the divine order. The gods created humans to perform labor that maintained the world's agricultural and ritual systems. Complete destruction of humanity would return the gods to their original problem. Who would perform the necessary work? Enki's insistence on preserving at least some humans reflects practical recognition that the divine realm depends on human offerings and worship. The vivid scene in Gilgamesh where the gods gather like flies around Utnapishtim's post-flood sacrifice illustrates this divine dependence. During the flood, when no humans existed to make offerings, the gods experienced deprivation. The relationship between Enki and Enlil, the god who instigates the flood, represents a fundamental tension in Mesopotamian theology between wisdom and power, preservation and destruction, flexible adaptation and rigid justice. Enlil served as king of the gods and god of storms, wind and atmospheric phenomena. His power was immense, but somewhat undifferentiated. The storm destroys without discrimination between worthy and unworthy. Enki's power was subtler, but more precisely targeted. He could solve specific problems through clever intervention rather than overwhelming force. This theological contrast appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian literature, with Enki frequently tempering or subverting Enlil's harsh decisions. The aftermath of the flood in all versions features confrontation between Enlil and Enkirs over the survival of the flood hero. Enlil's rage upon discovering that humans survived reveals his intention had been complete extermination. Enki's defense of his actions varies by version, but consistently emphasizes the injustice of destroying the innocent along with any guilty, and the foolishness of eliminating humanity entirely when less drastic solutions existed. In the Gilgamesh version, Enki directly rebukes Enlil. Quote 24. This speech reveals sophisticated ethical reasoning about proportional justice and the value of mercy. Enki argues that punishment should be targeted and proportional. Sinners should bear consequences for their specific sins, but punishment should not extend to the innocent, nor should it be so severe as to eliminate the possibility of reform. The reference to being quote 25 and quote 26 suggests that from Enki's perspective, the proper divine response to human failings is education and gradual reformation rather than catastrophic destruction. This theological position aligns with Enki's characterization as God of wisdom. Wisdom involves understanding, patience, and measured response rather than overwhelming force. The texts portray Enki's ultimate success in moderating divine policy toward humanity. While he could not prevent the flood entirely, his intervention ensured humanity's survival and led to Enlil's eventual acceptance of this outcome. The granting of immortality to the flood hero, performed by Enlil himself in the Gilgamesh version, represents Enlil's acknowledgement that Enki's position had merit. By blessing rather than punishing the survivor, Enlil implicitly accepts that complete human destruction was not the optimal solution. This divine reconciliation enabled the establishment of a new covenant between gods and humans that would prevent future attempts at total extermination. The question of divine motivation, why the gods decided to send the flood, receives different treatment in different versions of the story, and these variations reveal evolving theological perspectives across Mesopotamian history. In the Gilgamesh version, the motivation remains somewhat unclear. Enlil, the chief god who instigates the flood, acts almost capriciously, and the other gods seem to go along with his decision without extensive deliberation. The text suggests that humanity had become too numerous and noisy, disturbing the gods' rest. The complaint about human noise appears multiple times in Mesopotamian flood narratives, most explicitly in the Atrahasis Epic, where the problem is described in vivid detail. Quote 27. This passage presents human noise as the primary irritant motivating divine action. Though modern readers might find this justification inadequate for genocide, the noise complaint requires contextual understanding of Mesopotamian cosmology and temple theology. In Mesopotamian thought, the gods literally resided in their temples, dwelling in the innermost sanctuary where their cult statues stood. Temples were understood as the gods' houses where they required proper care, feeding through offerings, and appropriate quiet for rest. The proliferation of human cities and populations meant increasing noise levels that disturbed divine rest. From this perspective, the noise complaint represented not petty annoyance, but a genuine disruption of cosmic order. The gods could not fulfill their proper functions if perpetually disturbed by human racket. However, the Atrahasis Epic provides additional context suggesting that noise served as a symptom of a deeper problem: human overpopulation and the disruption this caused to the intended relationship between gods and humans. The text describes multiple divine attempts to control human population before resorting to the flood. First, Enlil sent plague through the god Namtar, then drought through withholding rain, then famine through agricultural failure. Each attempt aimed to reduce human numbers to a manageable level where the gods could benefit from human labour and worship without being overwhelmed by excessive human presence. The repeated failure of these graduated measures led finally to the flood as a last resort. This progression from limited interventions to catastrophic destruction reveals sophisticated thinking about proportional response and the escalation of conflict. The gods did not immediately resort to total destruction, but attempted various measured interventions first. Only after these failed, repeatedly frustrated by Enki's counter-interventions that helped humanity survive each crisis, did Enlil determine that complete extermination was necessary. From this perspective, the flood represented not capricious divine cruelty, but the final desperate act of a god who had exhausted all alternatives for managing an out-of-control human population. Some scholars have interpreted the noise complaint as a metaphor for human rebellion or moral transgression. In this reading, _quote_28_ represents not literal sound, but rather humanity's failure to properly respect divine authority, engaging in behaviour that challenged or ignored divine ordinances. This interpretation finds some support in the phrase, "the land was bellowing like a bull," which suggests not just volume but also aggressive, threatening sound. However, the texts themselves do not explicitly develop this metaphorical reading, leaving the noise complaint at face value without elaborating on specific human transgressions. The absence of detailed moral critique of humanity in most Mesopotamian flood versions stands in marked contrast to later biblical interpretation, where the flood is sent specifically in response to human wickedness and violence. Genesis chapter 6 states explicitly, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." This moral framework positions the flood as divine justice punishing human sin. The Mesopotamian versions, lacking this explicit moral condemnation, present the flood more as a practical measure to address overpopulation than as punishment for ethical failings. This difference in motivation reflects deeper theological distinctions between Mesopotamian and biblical worldviews. Mesopotamian theology generally portrayed gods as operating according to their own interests and needs, rather than enforcing universal moral principles. Gods could be arbitrary, inconsistent, or self-serving in ways that biblical monotheism would not permit. The flood in Mesopotamian context served divine convenience, reducing noise, decreasing demands on divine attention, and reasserting divine control over an independently flourishing human population. Biblical theology, by contrast, required that divine action serve moral purposes, making the flood a response to human evil rather than divine irritation. The Atrahasis Epic includes an intriguing additional element regarding divine motivation, the economic burden of maintaining the human population. The text suggests that as humans multiplied, their demand for divine attention and resources increased proportionally. Each city required its own patron deity, its own temple, its own ritual system. The proliferation of human settlements meant the proliferation of divine obligations and the division of offerings among ever more recipients. From this economic perspective, human overpopulation created an unsustainable burden on divine resources, motivating population reduction as a practical economic measure. The reaction of the gods during and after the flood provides further insight into divine motivation. The Gilgamesh version describes how the gods, having unleashed the flood, were terrified by its intensity and regretted their decision. The mother goddess Nintu laments, "How could I speak evil in the assembly of the gods, ordering battle to destroy my people? I myself gave birth to my people. Like the spawn of fish, they fill the sea." This regret suggests the divine decision was hasty and insufficiently considered, undermining any interpretation of the flood as carefully calibrated justice. The literary evidence for flood traditions in Mesopotamian culture is extensive and undeniable. But does archaeological evidence support the occurrence of actual catastrophic flooding in the region's ancient past? Beginning with Leonard Woolley's excavations at between 1922 and 1934, archaeologists have indeed discovered physical evidence of major flood events at multiple Mesopotamian sites. At Woolley uncovered a layer of water-deposited clay approximately 3 meters thick, separating earlier archaeological deposits from later Sumerian cultural materials. Woolley's discovery of this flood stratum generated enormous public interest when announced in 1929. The excavation had reached the level of early Ubaid period occupation, dating to approximately 4000 BC, when the team encountered a layer of clean, water-laid clay completely devoid of artifacts or occupation debris. After digging down through nearly 3 meters of this sterile clay, the excavators reached another occupation layer containing pottery and tools of even earlier date. Woolley interpreted this sterile layer as evidence of a massive flood that had inundated the city, depositing thick sediment before settlement resumed. The publicity surrounding Woolley's find led to sensational newspaper headlines proclaiming that Noah's flood had been discovered. Woolley himself, though more cautious in scholarly publications, did suggest in popular writings that this flood might represent the historical basis for the biblical and Mesopotamian flood traditions. He calculated that a flood depositing 3 meters of sediment would have required water depths of at least 7 to 8 meters covering the entire southern Mesopotamian plain, creating what would have seemed to ancient inhabitants as a world-destroying catastrophe. However, subsequent archaeological work complicated this straightforward interpretation. Other excavations at revealed that the flood layer was not uniform across the site. Some areas showed no flood deposit at all, while others showed layers of different thickness. This variation indicated that the flooding, while severe, was localized rather than covering the entire city uniformly. More significantly, excavations at other Mesopotamian sites revealed flood deposits at different stratigraphic levels, indicating that different sites had experienced major flooding at different times rather than all being inundated simultaneously. Excavations at Kish, conducted by Stephen Langdon and Ernest Mackay in the 1920s and early 1930s, uncovered a flood stratum approximately 40 centimeters thick, dating to approximately 3200 BC. At Shurapak, the city specifically named as the flood hero's home in multiple versions of the narrative, Eric Schmidt's excavations in the 1930s revealed evidence of significant flooding around 2900 BC. At Uruk, no flood deposit corresponding to either the Ur or Kish layers was found, though evidence of other flooding at different periods did appear. These chronological discrepancies demonstrated that no single catastrophic flood had inundated all of southern Mesopotamia simultaneously. The geological characteristics of the flood deposits provided further information about the nature of these inundation events. Analysis of the sediment revealed that the deposits consisted primarily of riverborne silt and clay rather than marine deposits, indicating that the flooding resulted from river overflow rather than coastal inundation or tsunami. The thickness of deposits varied considerably, from a few centimeters to several meters, reflecting variations in local topography and distance from river channels. The sediment contained no evidence of violent deposition such as would be expected from a tsunami, but rather show the characteristics of relatively calm water slowly depositing fine sediment over time. Modern geological and hydrological studies of the Mesopotamian floodplain have revealed that catastrophic flooding was not only possible, but probable given the region's geography and climate patterns. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, originating in the mountains of eastern Turkey and flowing across flat alluvial plains, were subject to seasonal flooding of varying intensity. Unusually heavy snowmelt in the mountains combined with spring rains could generate flood waves that overwhelmed riverbanks and inundated large areas of the plain. The flat topography of southern Mesopotamia meant that floodwaters could spread across vast areas, creating temporary inland seas that might persist for weeks or months. Archaeological evidence indicates that ancient Mesopotamian cities employed various flood protection measures, suggesting that flooding was a recognized and recurring threat. City walls often incorporated features designed to protect against water as well as human enemies. Excavations have revealed drainage systems, elevated building platforms, and canal systems designed to redirect floodwaters. The very existence of these protective measures indicates that severe flooding occurred with sufficient frequency to justify substantial engineering efforts at mitigation. The chronological distribution of flood deposits across multiple sites, rather than undermining the flood narrative tradition, actually supports the interpretation that Mesopotamian culture preserved memories of multiple severe flood events over many centuries. The Sumerian king list statement that, quote, 32 need not refer to a single catastrophic event, but might represent a cultural memory of recurring catastrophic floods that periodically disrupted civilization. The literary tradition could have consolidated memories of multiple historical floods into a single archetypal narrative that captured the essential experience of catastrophic inundation and miraculous survival. To understand why flood narratives became so central to Mesopotamian culture, it's essential to consider the geographical and hydrological realities of the region. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, was fundamentally shaped by water, both as a life-giving force that enabled agriculture and civilization, and as destructive power that could devastate communities without warning. Unlike the Nile in Egypt, which flooded predictably each year at the same season, the Tigris and Euphrates were capricious. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers originate in the Armenian highlands of eastern Turkey, where winter snowpack accumulates in mountains exceeding 3,000 meters in elevation. The spring melt of this snowpack, combined with seasonal rainfall in the headwaters region, determines the magnitude of downstream flooding. The timing of maximum flow typically occurs in late March through May, but can vary considerably depending on weather patterns in the mountains. Unlike the Nile, whose flood timing was astronomically predictable based on the heliacal rising of Sirius, the Mesopotamian river's flood magnitude and precise timing varied unpredictably from year to year. The gradient and velocity of these rivers also differed significantly from the Nile. The Tigris descends relatively steeply from the mountains to the plain, creating faster current and more erosive power than the Nile. During flood season, the Tigris could rise extremely rapidly, with water levels increasing several meters in a matter of hours. This rapid rise gave riverside communities little warning before inundation. Ancient texts describe the Tigris as violent and destructive, requiring constant maintenance of protective levees and careful management of irrigation systems that drew from its waters. The Euphrates, while slower and less violent than the Tigris, presented different challenges. Its meandering course across the flat alluvial plain shifted over time, with the river periodically changing its bed and stranding former riverside settlements kilometers from water access. Archaeological surveys of southern Mesopotamia have identified numerous abandoned settlement mounds that were clearly riverside locations in antiquity but now sit isolated in the desert, evidence of the Euphrates' shifting course. This hydro-instability meant that communities dependent on river access for irrigation and transport faced existential threat from changes in river course. The flat topography of southern Mesopotamia meant that floodwaters could spread across enormous areas with minimal depth required. The gradient from the point where the rivers emerge from the Piedmont onto the flat plain to the Persian Gulf, a distance of approximately 600 kilometers, averaged only a few centimeters per kilometer. This minimal slope meant that floodwaters flowed very slowly, spreading laterally rather than flowing rapidly downstream. A flood wave entering the plain could inundate hundreds of square kilometers, creating temporary shallow lakes that might persist for weeks before slowly draining. The soil composition of the Mesopotamian plain contributed to both agricultural fertility and flood vulnerability. The alluvial soils consisted primarily of fine silt and clay deposited over millennia by river floods. While extraordinarily fertile when irrigated, these fine-grained soils drained poorly and became waterlogged easily. When floods inundated fields and settlements, the water did not quickly percolate into the ground, but rather sat on the surface, turning the land into marshland that could not support agriculture or habitation until it slowly dried over weeks or months. The ancient Mesopotamians developed sophisticated hydraulic engineering to manage these challenging conditions. Canal systems diverted river water for irrigation, while also serving as flood control measures to carry excess water away from settled areas. The construction and maintenance of these canal systems required enormous labour investment and constant attention. Cuneiform administrative texts from various cities document the assignment of labour crews to canal maintenance, the calculation of earth volumes to be moved, and the distribution of rations to workers. This hydraulic infrastructure represented civilization's attempt to control and benefit from water while protecting against its destructive potential. However, the same canal systems that protected against moderate floods could worsen catastrophic flooding. During extreme flood events, canals designed to carry controlled water flows could become conduits for uncontrolled inundation, channeling floodwaters directly into agricultural areas and settlements. The interconnected nature of canal systems meant that flooding in one area could propagate through the entire network. Additionally, breaches in canal walls or protective levees could create cascading failures, with initial small breaches rapidly expanding as water scoured away earthen walls. Ancient texts preserve evidence of the constant struggle against water. Royal inscriptions commonly boast of canal construction and maintenance as primary achievements of kingship. The Code of Hammurabi, the famous Babylonian law code dating to around 1748 BC, includes regulations governing water management and imposing penalties for negligence that led to flood damage. One law states, quote, 3.3. This legal provision demonstrates that flood damage from hydraulic mismanagement was common enough to require specific legal remedies. The seasonal rhythm of Mesopotamian agriculture was dictated entirely by water availability and flood timing. The agricultural year began in autumn with ploughing and planting, utilizing residual soil moisture from summer floods. Winter rains, when they occurred, provided supplemental moisture. Spring brought the flood season, which could either provide beneficial irrigation or devastating inundation depending on magnitude and timing. Summer was the harvest season, but also the period of maximum heat and minimum river flow, when irrigation became critical for crop survival. This annual cycle meant that the population lived in constant awareness of water as both essential resource and potential destroyer. The marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates approached the Persian Gulf, represented a unique environment where water permanently dominated the landscape. These marshes, which persisted into modern times until deliberately drained in the late 20th century, consisted of vast wetlands with scattered islands of higher ground supporting reed-built settlements. The marsh-dwelling populations developed distinct cultures, adapted to aquatic environments, using reed boats for transport, building houses from woven reed mats, and depending on fish and waterfowl rather than grain agriculture. The existence of these permanent marshes demonstrated that in southern Mesopotamia, the boundary between land and water was fluid and uncertain. While localized Mesopotamian flooding provides one context for understanding flood narratives, recent archaeological and geological research has identified a period of dramatic global climate change that may have influenced flood traditions across multiple cultures. The Younger Dryas period, lasting from approximately 10,800 BC to 9,600 BC, represents one of the most abrupt climate shifts in recent geological history. The Younger Dryas takes its name from the Dryas octopetala, an Arctic alpine wildflower whose pollen appears prominently in sediment cores from this period, indicating that Arctic conditions extended far south of their current range. The period was first identified in Scandinavian peat bogs during the early 20th century, where geologists noticed a distinct layer containing cold climate plant species sandwiched between layers containing temperate vegetation. This stratigraphic evidence indicated that warming temperatures following the last glacial maximum were interrupted by a dramatic return to near-glacial conditions that persisted for over a millennium. Ice core data from Greenland has provided the most detailed record of Younger Dryas climate conditions. The GIS P2 ice core project, completed in the early 1990s by drilling through more than 3,000 meters of Greenland ice, retrieved annual ice layers preserving atmospheric conditions extending back over 100,000 years. Analysis of oxygen isotope ratios in the ice reveals that temperatures in Greenland dropped by approximately 15 degrees Celsius within a single decade at the onset of the Younger Dryas. This rate of temperature change is extraordinary by geological standards. Climate shifts that would normally occur over thousands of years compressed into less than a human lifetime. The abruptness of the Younger Dryas onset has generated considerable scientific debate about causation. The leading hypothesis proposes that massive freshwater discharge from glacial Lake Agassiz in North America disrupted the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the ocean current system that transports tropical heat to northern latitudes. As the North American ice sheets melted during the warming period following the last glacial maximum, enormous volumes of meltwater accumulated in glacial lakes. Around 10,800 BC, geological evidence suggests that Lake Agassiz, which contained more water than all modern Great Lakes combined, catastrophically drained into the North Atlantic through the St. Lawrence Valley. The sudden influx of cold fresh water into the North Atlantic, estimated at multiple sverdrups, millions of cubic meters per second, would have reduced the salinity of surface waters, preventing the normal sinking of dense salty water that drives the thermohaline circulation. Without this circulation transporting warm water northward, temperatures across the North Atlantic region plummeted. Paleoclimate modelling has demonstrated that disruption of Atlantic overturning circulation produces temperature patterns matching those preserved in geological records from the Younger Dryas period. However, alternative hypotheses have been proposed to explain the Younger Dryas onset. In 2007, Richard Firestone and colleagues published evidence suggesting that an extraterrestrial impact event occurred at the beginning of the Younger Dryas period. Their analysis of sediment cores from multiple North American sites revealed a distinct layer dating to 10,800 BC containing high concentrations of microscopic diamonds, magnetic spherules, and iridium, materials associated with cosmic impacts. Additional evidence included a layer of carbon-rich material indicating widespread wildfires occurring simultaneously across the continent. The extraterrestrial impact hypothesis proposes that a comet or asteroid fragment exploded over the North American ice sheet, generating sufficient heat to rapidly melt large volumes of ice, while simultaneously igniting continental-scale wildfires. The meltwater pulse would have triggered the shutdown of Atlantic circulation described in the traditional hypothesis, while the atmospheric effects of widespread fires and impact ejecta could have contributed to global cooling. This scenario would explain both the abruptness of the Younger Dryas onset and the evidence of simultaneous catastrophic events across multiple continents. Critics of the impact hypothesis have questioned whether the proposed evidence definitively indicates extraterrestrial origin rather than terrestrial processes. However, ongoing research continues to identify additional sites containing the characteristic Younger Dryas boundary layer, now documented at locations across North America, Europe, and the Middle East. Recent studies have identified platinum anomalies in ice cores corresponding to the Younger Dryas onset, providing independent support for an extraterrestrial input at this time. The environmental consequences of the Younger Dryas extended far beyond temperature changes. Sea levels, which had been rising as ice sheets melted following the last glacial maximum, temporarily stabilized or even declined slightly as cooling allowed ice sheet readvancement. This sea level fluctuation would have affected coastal populations worldwide, alternately exposing and inundating coastal plains. In the Middle East, the period coincides with significant changes in settlement patterns and subsistence strategies documented in archaeological records. The archaeological record from the Levant reveals that the Younger Dryas period corresponds with the transition from Natufian culture, which had developed increasingly sedentary settlements and intensive wild grain harvesting, to the early Neolithic cultures that developed true agriculture. Some archaeologists have proposed that the climate stress of the Younger Dryas forced human populations to develop agriculture as wild food resources became scarce. The necessity of reliable food production in deteriorating climatic conditions may have driven the innovations that led to the domestication of wheat, barley, and other foundational crops. In Mesopotamia, the Younger Dryas period predates the earliest known settlements, but its climatic effects would have shaped the environment that later populations inhabited. The period's cooler, drier conditions would have reduced river flow and altered vegetation patterns across the region. When the Younger Dryas ended around 9600 BC, the return to warmer, wetter conditions would have increased river flow dramatically, potentially causing severe flooding as ice melt accelerated and precipitation patterns shifted. This climatic transition may have created conditions for the catastrophic floods that entered cultural memory. The global extent of Younger Dryas climate impacts means that cultures worldwide would have experienced this period as a time of environmental catastrophe. The synchronicity of climate deterioration across different continents could explain why flood traditions appear in cultures with no apparent historical contact. If the Younger Dryas period included both the initial cooling event and subsequent warming that triggered massive flooding from ice melt and increased precipitation, then geographically separated populations would independently preserve memories of catastrophic inundation, occurring within the same general time frame. Recent analysis of speleothem records, mineral deposits in caves that preserve climate information, has revealed that the Younger Dryas period included dramatic shifts in monsoon patterns affecting tropical and subtropical regions. Evidence from caves in China indicates that the Asian monsoon weakened significantly during this period, reducing summer rainfall across much of East Asia. Conversely, some regions experienced increased precipitation. This global reorganization of atmospheric circulation patterns would have created conditions for both drought and flooding in different regions, potentially affecting human populations across multiple continents simultaneously. Mesopotamian tradition preserved accounts of 7 semi-divine beings called the Apkallu, or sages, who brought civilization to humanity in the time before the flood. These figures appear in various texts as possessing extraordinary wisdom and serving as advisors to the antediluvian kings listed in the Sumerian king list. The first and most important of these sages was Adapa, described in multiple texts as he who completed the plans of heaven and earth. The Apkallu tradition appears in multiple sources spanning over a millennium of Mesopotamian literature. The most comprehensive account comes from the Uruk list of kings and sages, a late Babylonian tablet dating to the Seleucid period around the 2nd century BC, but clearly based on much older traditions. This text names 7 Apkallu, who served as advisors to the 8 antediluvian kings enumerated in the Sumerian king list. Each Apkallu is associated with a specific king and credited with particular achievements or areas of expertise. The name Apkallu itself derives from the Sumerian Abgal-lu, meaning great water sage, or sage of the Apsu, connecting these beings directly with Enki and his freshwater domain. This aquatic association appears in multiple traditions, describing the Apkallu as fish-like beings who emerge from the sea to teach humanity. The Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in Greek during the 3rd century BC, preserved traditions about a being called Oannes, who emerged from the Persian Gulf during the day to instruct humans in writing, arts, and agriculture, then returned to the sea at night. Berossus describes Oannes as amphibious, with a fish body and human head, or alternatively as a man wearing a fish cloak. Adapa, the first and most famous Apkallu, appears in multiple texts beyond the sage lists. The legend of Adapa, preserved on tablets from both the 14th century BC Amarna archive in Egypt and the 7th century BC library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, presents Adapa as a priest of Enki in the city of Eridu. The text describes him as possessing extraordinary wisdom granted by Enki, though denied immortality. Adapa's wisdom included knowledge of the proper rituals for maintaining cosmic order understanding of celestial phenomena, and mastery of magical arts. The legend of Adapa includes a narrative episode that reveals the complexity of divine-human relations in Mesopotamian theology. While fishing to provide offerings for Enki's temple, Adapa was caught in a storm created by the south wind. In anger, he cursed the south wind and broke its wing, causing it to cease blowing for 7 days. This disruption of natural order attracted the attention of Anu, the sky god, who summoned Adapa to heaven to explain his actions. Before departing, Adapa received advice from Enki about how to conduct himself in the divine realm. He should mourn for the gods Dumuzi and Gizida, refuse food and drink offered by Anu, but accept clothing and oil. Adapa followed Enki's instructions precisely, successfully placating Anu and the divine council through his mourning ritual, which impressed the gods Dumuzi and Gizida, who served as gatekeepers. However, when Anu offered him the bread and water of life that would grant immortality, Adapa refused as Enki had instructed, not realizing that Enki's advice was intended to prevent him from achieving divine status. The text presents this as a tragic miscommunication. Adapa's perfect obedience to Enki's instructions prevented him from grasping the immortality that was briefly within reach. Anu, recognizing what had occurred, sent Adapa back to Earth, where he would eventually die despite his great wisdom. This narrative reveals several important aspects of the Apkallu tradition. First, these sages possessed wisdom sufficient to navigate successfully in the divine realm, understanding proper protocols for interacting with gods. Second, their knowledge, while extensive, was not complete. Adapa could be misled despite his wisdom. Third, the sages served as intermediaries between divine and human realms, capable of moving between these domains while remaining fundamentally mortal. The denial of immortality to Adapa despite his wisdom established that the Apkallu, however extraordinary, remained distinct from gods. The other 6 antediluvian Apkallu received less extensive literary treatment, but appear consistently in king and sage lists, Yuan, also called Adapa in some sources, creating some confusion about whether these represent the same figure or different individuals. Enmeduga served as sage to the king of Sipar and was associated with astronomical knowledge and divination. Enmegalana served at Bad Tibira and was credited with knowledge of metalworking and craftsmanship. Enmebuluga, associated with the city of Lerak, possessed expertise in ritual purification and apotropaic magic. The remaining sages, Anenlilda, Utu-Abzu, and an unnamed 7th sage, received mention in lists but minimal narrative development in surviving texts. The collective achievements attributed to the 7 Apkallu encompassed the full range of civilizational knowledge. They established the temple system and taught the proper rituals for maintaining divine favor. They introduced writing and mathematics necessary for administration and commerce. They taught metallurgy, enabling the production of bronze tools and weapons. They developed irrigation engineering and agricultural techniques. They established divination methods for determining divine will and predicting future events. Essentially, every aspect of civilized life was credited to instruction by these antediluvian sages. The relationship between the Apkallu and the flood represents a crucial element of the tradition. All sources agree that the 7 sages existed before the flood and that their era ended with the deluge. Post-flood sages appear in some lists but are described as fully human rather than semi-divine beings, and their wisdom is portrayed as derivative of antediluvian knowledge rather than original divine instruction. This suggests that the flood represented not just physical catastrophe, but a fundamental break in the transmission of divine wisdom to humanity. However, the tradition also emphasizes that the Apkallu's knowledge was not entirely lost in the flood. Multiple texts describe how the sages preserved wisdom by burying texts and sacred objects before the deluge, creating repositories of knowledge that could be recovered afterward. The Uruk list of kings and sages states that one Apkallu, sometimes identified as Utu-Abzu, quote, 37 before the flood. suggesting he escaped destruction. These preservation narratives explain how post-flood civilization could rebuild so rapidly. The fundamental knowledge existed in preserved form, requiring only recovery and reapplication. The specifications for the flood vessel described in Mesopotamian texts carry symbolic significance that extends beyond practical maritime engineering. In the Gilgamesh version, the boat is described as cube-shaped with equal dimensions, a form that has no practical advantage for floating and would actually be quite unstable. This geometric choice appears deliberate and symbolic rather than functional. The cubic form held profound significance in Mesopotamian sacred architecture and cosmology. The innermost sanctuary of Mesopotamian temples, called the cella, where the divine statue resided, was typically designed as a perfect cube. This cubic holy space represented the point of maximum divine presence on earth, the location where heaven and earth intersected most directly. The dimensions of temple cellars were carefully calculated according to sacred proportions, with the cubic form signifying perfection, completeness, and cosmic order. By describing the flood vessel as cubic, the Mesopotamian texts transformed it from a simple boat into a floating temple, a mobile sacred space that preserved divine order through the chaos of the flood. This interpretation gained support from the description of the vessel's interior divisions, 7 levels created by 6 decks, with 9 compartments on each level. The number 7 represented divine perfection and completeness in Mesopotamian numerology, appearing repeatedly in ritual contexts. The number 9 held similar sacred significance, being the square of 3, itself a number of divine power. The total number of compartments described in the Gilgamesh version, 63, calculated as 7 levels times 9 compartments, equals 9 times 7, creating a numerological structure that reinforces the sacred nature of the vessel. This mathematical organization appears too precise to be coincidental. The vessel's design encodes sacred numbers that would have been immediately recognizable to ancient Mesopotamian audiences as signifying divine order and cosmic perfection. The waterproofing materials specified in the flood narratives also carry symbolic resonance beyond practical function. The extensive use of bitumen, explicitly quantified in the texts with specific measurements, connected the vessel to Mesopotamian sacred architecture, where bitumen served both practical and ritual purposes. Temples, ziggurats, and palace complexes throughout Mesopotamia employed bitumen extensively for waterproofing foundations, binding bricks, and creating impermeable surfaces. The substance's natural occurrence in Mesopotamia, seeping from the ground in certain locations, led to its association with the Apsu, Enki's subterranean freshwater domain. The 7-day construction period described for the vessel parallels other 7-day sequences in Mesopotamian literature, most notably creation narratives that describe the organization of the cosmos over 7 days. The Enuma Elish creation epic, while not specifying exact durations, organizes creation events in sequences that scholars have interpreted as 7-day frameworks. The completion of the flood vessel on the 7th day mirrors the completion of creation, suggesting that boat construction represented not just practical preparation, but a recapitulation of cosmic creation, building a world container that would preserve life through chaos and enable new creation afterward. The loading of the vessel reinforces its role as a cosmic repository. Utnapishtim describes bringing aboard not just family and animals, but also craftsmen of every kind, precious metals, and seed of all living things. This comprehensive collection transforms the vessel into a microcosm containing all elements necessary for rebuilding civilization. The inclusion of craftsmen ensured preservation not just of biological life, but of technical knowledge and skilled practice. The precious metals represented wealth, necessary for reconstructing economic systems. The comprehensive seed collection enabled agricultural restoration. The vessel's function as cosmic container finds parallel in other ancient Near Eastern traditions about divine boats. Egyptian religious texts frequently describe the sun god Ra travelling through the sky and underworld in a solar bark, a boat that carried not just the god but the order and stability of the cosmos itself. When the solar bark successfully navigated the dangerous underworld journey each night, the sun could rise again, maintaining cosmic order. The flood vessel served analogous functions, carrying cosmic order through chaos to enable its re-establishment afterward. The contrast between the cubic flood vessel and conventional boat design appears even more striking when considering Mesopotamian familiarity with practical maritime architecture. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamian sites includes models and representations of various watercraft types, reed boats for marshland navigation, wooden boats for river transport, round coracles for crossing currents. The Mesopotamians clearly understood practical boat design, making their choice of a cubic form for the flood vessel obviously symbolic rather than practical. The sealing of the vessel receives particular emphasis in multiple flood narratives, with specific descriptions of how the door was closed and sealed with pitch. This sealing transformed the interior into a completely enclosed space, isolated from the external chaos of the flood. The sealed vessel became a protected cosmos, maintaining internal order while external order collapsed. The inability to see outside during the flood, necessarily resulting from complete waterproofing, meant that those inside experienced total dependence on divine protection. They could neither navigate nor assess conditions, but could only trust that the vessel would fulfill its preservative function. When the vessel comes to rest on a mountain after the flood, the geographical detail carries cosmological significance. Mountains in Mesopotamian thought served as meeting points between heaven and earth, locations where the divine and human realms intersected. The cosmic mountain, sometimes called the Mountain of the World or Mountain of the Gods, represented the axis mundi, the cosmic centre around which the universe was organised. By landing on a mountain, the flood vessel arrived at the optimal location for beginning cosmic renewal, the point of closest connection between human and divine realms. Different versions of the Mesopotamian flood narrative provide varying accounts of how long the deluge lasted, and these temporal details reveal interesting patterns. The Gilgamesh account is most specific. The storm lasted 6 days and 7 nights, after which the waters began to recede. Utnapishtim describes how he released birds on the 7th, 8th and 9th days to test whether dry land had appeared. The precision of this chronology deserves careful attention. The 6-day storm duration, followed by 7th-day cessation, creates a temporal structure that mirrors the sacred 7-day cycle, fundamental to Mesopotamian calendrics and ritual life. The storm itself, described with vivid intensity in the Gilgamesh text, begins at evening when Shamash gives the signal, continues through 6 full days and nights, and ceases on the morning of the 7th day. This timing means that the floodwaters rose during 6 complete day-night cycles before the storm ended, creating a complete temporal unit. The text provides remarkable detail about the storm's progression and intensity. When the appointed time arrived, the rider of the storm released devastating rain at evening. Utnapishtim describes looking at the weather conditions and being terrified by what he saw, prompting him to enter the vessel and seal the door. Once the storm began, even the gods were frightened by its intensity. The text states that the gods cowered like dogs, crouching against outer walls. Even the divine council that ordered the flood was terrified by what they had unleashed, suggesting the catastrophe exceeded their expectations or intentions. The description of the storm's effects includes both meteorological and cosmic elements. The normal cycles of day and night disappeared. The text states that all day long the south wind blew, blowing fast, submerging the mountains, overwhelming the people like an attack. The obliteration of day-night distinction suggests that the storm created atmospheric conditions so severe that daylight could not penetrate the clouds and particulate matter filling the air. This detail implies not just heavy rain, but also massive quantities of airborne debris, perhaps from erosion, landslides, or other secondary effects of the deluge. The seventh-day cessation of the storm initiated a new phase, the slow recession of floodwaters. Utnapishtim describes how the sea grew quiet, the tempest stilled, and the flood ceased. Looking around, he saw that all of humanity had turned to clay, the vivid image capturing the dissolution of civilization back into the primordial mud from which, according to Mesopotamian tradition, humans were originally formed. This reversal of creation emphasized the flood's comprehensive destructiveness, not just killing humans but reducing them to undifferentiated matter. The water's recession proceeded gradually rather than immediately. The text describes how on the seventh day, when the storm ceased, the vessel came to rest on Mount Nemush. However, the mountain only emerged gradually from the receding waters. Utnapishtim states that the mountain held the boat fast, not allowing it to move. For 6 additional days the mountain held the vessel while waters continued receding. This second 6-day period created structural symmetry with the 6 days of rising waters, 6 days of increase followed by storm cessation, then 6 days of decrease before bird testing began. The timing of the bird releases follows a measured progression. On the 7th day after the vessel grounded, which was also the 13th day after the flood began, Utnapishtim released a dove. The dove found no resting place and returned to the boat. This indicated that waters still covered the lowland sufficiently, that no dry land suitable for perching existed within the dove's flying range. Doves, being relatively weak flyers unable to remain airborne indefinitely, required nearby resting places, making them ideal indicators of local land availability. On the 8th day after grounding, Utnapishtim released a swallow. Swallows, also relatively short-range flyers, require perching locations and cannot survive extended time over open water. The swallow likewise found no resting place and returned, indicating that conditions had not yet changed sufficiently for bird survival. The text's specification of these particular birds reflects detailed observational knowledge of avian behaviour. Both doves and swallows are land birds that require solid ground and vegetation, making them appropriate indicators of environmental recovery. The release of the raven on the 9th day produced different results. Ravens, being larger and more powerful flyers capable of surviving extended periods over water, by resting on floating debris, could survive even if no dry land existed. The text states that the raven went forth and saw that the waters had diminished. It eats, it scratches, it bobs, but it does not return. This behavioural description reveals careful observation. The raven found sufficient food in the receding waters, either from floating carrion or exposed mudflats, eliminating its motivation to return to the vessel. The total duration from storm onset to raven's non-return spans approximately 15 days in the Gilgamesh chronology, 6 days of rising waters, 1 day of storm cessation and vessel grounding, 6 days of water recession, then 3 days of bird testing. This 15-day period, while specific, does not constitute a complete temporal unit in Mesopotamian calendrics, suggesting the chronology emphasizes narrative structure rather than sacred numerology. However, some scholars have noted that 15 days represents half of a lunar month, potentially connecting the flood duration to lunar cycles. The Atrahasis version provides different temporal information, though fragmentary preservation complicates reconstruction of the complete chronology. The preserved portions describe the flood's onset but break off before describing its duration. When the text resumes, it references 7 days and 7 nights, though whether this describes the storm duration or the total flood period remains unclear due to missing context. The prominence of 7 in both Gilgamesh and Atrahasis suggests this number held particular significance in flood tradition, regardless of whether it measured storm duration or another temporal element. One of the most memorable episodes in the flood narratives involves the hero sending out birds to determine whether the waters have receded enough for disembarkation. This detail appears consistently across versions and would later be incorporated into the biblical account. In the Gilgamesh version, Utnapishtim releases 3 birds in succession. First a dove, which finds no resting place and returns, then a swallow, which likewise returns, and finally a raven, which does not return, indicating that dry land has appeared. The bird testing sequence demonstrates sophisticated understanding of animal behavior and ecological requirements. Each bird species selected for release possessed specific characteristics that made it suitable for assessing environmental conditions. The progression from weaker, more dependent species to stronger, more adaptable ones created a graduated testing system that provided increasingly reliable information about land availability and habitability. Doves, the first birds released in the Gilgamesh sequence, are members of the Columbidae family, characterized by relatively weak flight muscles and high energy requirements. Doves cannot remain airborne for extended periods and must perch frequently to rest. Their diet consists primarily of seeds and grains, requiring dry land with vegetation. The dove's return to the ark indicated that no dry, vegetated land existed within its limited flight range. Conditions remained too wet for the vegetation necessary to support dove populations. The choice of doves also carried symbolic significance in Mesopotamian culture. Doves were associated with the goddess Ishtar, serving as her sacred bird and appearing frequently in iconographic representations of the goddess. The dove's return to the vessel therefore carried connotations beyond simple ornithological observation, suggesting that even Ishtar's domain, the natural world of growth and fertility, remained submerged and unavailable for regeneration. Swallows, released second in the sequence, belong to the Hirundinidae family and possess somewhat greater flying endurance than doves. However, swallows also require specific environmental conditions. They are insectivorous birds that catch flying insects in aerial pursuit. Their ability to feed depends on the presence of active insect populations, which in turn requires warm temperatures, vegetation, and dry conditions. The swallow's return indicated that while the waters might have receded further, conditions remained unsuitable for the re-establishment of complex food webs involving insects and their predators. Swallows also nested in structures and cliffs, requiring solid substrates for building mud nests. The absence of suitable nesting sites would have prevented swallow survival, even if food were available. The swallow's return thus indicated that neither feeding nor nesting requirements for this species were met, suggesting that while land might be emerging, it remained barren and inhospitable. The raven, released third, represents a dramatic contrast to the previous birds. Ravens, members of the Corvidae family, are among the most adaptable and intelligent birds, capable of exploiting diverse food sources and surviving in harsh conditions. Ravens are omnivorous scavengers that can feed on carrion, insects, seeds, and virtually any organic matter. Their powerful flight allows extended aerial searches for food without requiring frequent perching. Most significantly for the flood narrative, ravens can feed on floating carrion, giving them survival advantages in partially flooded landscapes. The text's description of the raven's behavior reveals detailed observation. Quote, 42. Each verb describes specific raven behaviors. The eating indicates successful food location, likely floating animal carcasses. The scratching refers to ravens' characteristic ground foraging behavior, using their feet to uncover food items. This detail suggests that exposed mudflats or beaches had emerged where the raven could forage. The bobbing likely describes the raven riding on floating objects, demonstrating its ability to rest on debris without returning to the vessel. The raven's non-return provided crucial information. Conditions now existed where at least highly adaptable species could survive independently. The landscape remained far from fully recovered, but the presence of food sources and the absence of universal water coverage indicated that the worst of the catastrophe had passed. Disembarkation remained premature for most species, but the ecological recovery process had begun. The graduated bird testing sequence reflects sophisticated understanding of ecological succession, the process by which ecosystems recover from catastrophic disturbance. The narrative recognizes that different species have different environmental requirements, and that ecosystem recovery proceeds through stages. The return of the dove and swallow, followed by the raven's success, accurately describes early succession dynamics, generalist scavengers. Recolonize disturbed areas before specialist species dependent on complex food webs. The biblical flood narrative, written centuries after the Mesopotamian versions, modified the bird sequence while preserving its essential structure. Genesis describes Noah releasing a raven first, which went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth, then releasing a dove 3 times at 7-day intervals. The first dove release produced no result, the second brought back an olive leaf, and the third dove did not return. This sequence reverses the Mesopotamian order by releasing the raven first, and extends the dove testing across 3 attempts, but preserves the fundamental concept of using bird behavior to assess environmental recovery. The biblical modification that has the dove return with an olive leaf adds explicit botanical information absent from the Mesopotamian versions. The olive leaf demonstrates not just dry land, but vegetative recovery. Trees growing with sufficient vigour to produce foliage. This detail emphasises not just survival conditions, but returning fertility. The Mesopotamian versions imply vegetation through the bird's food requirements, but do not explicitly describe its observation. The bird testing episode's consistent appearance across all flood narrative versions, from the earlier Sumerian fragments through Akkadian versions to the biblical account, demonstrates its centrality to the flood tradition. The episode serves multiple narrative functions simultaneously. It creates suspense through repeated testing, demonstrates the hero's wisdom in assessing conditions before exposing his family to danger, provides concrete evidence of environmental recovery, and marks the transition from survival to renewal. The specific ornithological knowledge embedded in the bird choices and behavioural observations grounds the narrative in empirical observation, suggesting that whoever developed this tradition possessed detailed understanding of avian ecology. All versions of the flood narrative specify that the boat came to rest on a mountain when the waters receded, though different texts identify different mountains. The Gilgamesh account names Mount Nimush, generally identified with the Pir-Omar Gudrun range in modern Iraqi Kurdistan. The biblical account, which derives from these earlier Mesopotamian sources, names Mount Ararat in what is now eastern Turkey. Mount Nimush, mentioned in the Gilgamesh tablet as the landing site for Utnapishtim's vessel, has been tentatively identified by scholars with the Pir-Omar Gudrun mountain range, located approximately 300 kilometers north of Baghdad in the Zagros Mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan. This range reaches elevations exceeding 2,700 meters, making it among the highest peaks visible from the Mesopotamian plain. The identification remains uncertain because ancient geographical nomenclature did not always correspond precisely to modern toponyms, and mountain names shifted over millennia as different populations occupied the region. The choice of a northern mountain for the vessel's landing reflects geographical logic given Mesopotamian topography and flood dynamics. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flow from north to south, descending from the Armenian highlands through Mesopotamia to the Persian Gulf. A massive flood originating from these rivers would carry floating objects generally southward, though local currents and winds could deflect the path. However, as floodwaters receded and drained back toward river channels, objects might become stranded on elevated terrain. The northern mountains, being closest to the flood's headwaters and rising to substantial elevations, represented plausible locations where a floating vessel might ground as waters subsided. The symbolic significance of mountain landing sites extends beyond practical geography to encompass Mesopotamian cosmological concepts. Mountains in ancient Near Eastern thought served as liminal spaces where heaven and earth met, locations where divine and human realms intersected most directly. The cosmic mountain, a concept appearing throughout Mesopotamian religious thought, represented the axis mundi around which the universe was organized. Temples and ziggurats were often conceived as artificial cosmic mountains, replicating in architecture the sacred geography of divine dwelling places. Several important Mesopotamian temples and cult centres were located in or near mountainous regions, reflecting the sacred status of elevated places. The city of Arbela, modern Erbil in Iraqi Kurdistan, served as a major cult centre for the goddess Ishtar and was located in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. The association between mountains and divine presence appears in numerous royal inscriptions describing kings travelling to mountainous regions to encounter deities or perform sacred rituals. The landing of the flood vessel on a mountain therefore positioned the survivors at an optimal location for divine human interaction during the critical transition from destruction to renewal. The Atrahasis Epic, in its fragmentary preserved form, does not clearly specify which mountain received the vessel, though references to the mountain appear in damaged contexts suggesting a landing site was described in the lost portions. Some scholars have proposed that different versions of the flood narrative may have identified different mountains based on regional traditions or political considerations. Cities and regions competed for prestige in ancient Mesopotamia, and claiming association with the flood landing site could enhance a location's sacred status. The biblical flood narrative's identification of Mount Ararat represents a later development in the transmission of flood traditions from Mesopotamian to Hebrew sources. Mount Ararat, known in Turkish as Ağrı, is a massive volcanic peak in eastern Turkey near the borders with Armenia and Iran, reaching an elevation of 5,137 metres. This mountain was visible from considerable distances across the ancient Near East and held sacred significance for multiple cultures. The Hebrew text of Genesis actually uses the term Mountains of Ararat, plural, which may refer to the Ararat Range generally rather than the specific peak modern readers identify as Mount Ararat. Archaeological surveys in the Ararat region have been conducted periodically since the 19th century, motivated partly by interest in locating remains of Noah's Ark. These expeditions, while generating considerable popular interest, have not produced credible evidence of ancient vessel remains. The extreme elevation, harsh climate, and active volcanic nature of Mount Ararat make long-term preservation of wooden structures highly unlikely. Glacial activity, earthquakes, and erosion would have obliterated any organic remains over the millennia since the flood narratives were composed. The identification of Mount Nimush in Iraqi Kurdistan, however, has received less archaeological attention, despite being the mountain specified in the oldest complete flood narrative. The political instability of the region and the challenges of conducting archaeological work in mountainous terrain have limited systematic investigation. However, the lower elevation and less extreme climate of the Zagros Ranges compared to Mount Ararat would theoretically provide better conditions for preservation of archaeological materials if any flood-related sites existed. The landing on a mountain creates a specific narrative problem that the texts address through the bird testing sequence. A vessel grounded on a mountain peak would be stranded far from the valleys and plains where human settlement and agriculture were possible. The flood hero could not simply disembark and resume normal life at high elevation in alpine conditions unsuitable for the crops and livestock necessary for civilization. The bird testing therefore served to determine not just whether the flood had ended, but whether the lowlands had dried sufficiently for human habitation. Only when the birds confirmed lowland recovery could safe descent from the mountain and re-establishment of civilization begin. The descent from the mountain receives minimal attention in most versions of the flood narrative, with texts typically moving directly from the vessel's landing to the sacrifice and divine encounter. This narrative compression suggests that the mountain served primarily symbolic rather than geographical functions in the story. The mountain represented the point of closest contact between human survivors and the divine realm, the location where human and cosmic renewal could be negotiated. The specific challenges of descending from a mountain peak with family, animals, and supplies receive no narrative attention because they were not theologically significant. Some later Jewish and Christian traditions developed elaborate descriptions of the descent from Ararat and the subsequent dispersal of Noah's family across the earth, filling narrative gaps left by the biblical account. These traditions identified specific routes of descent and locations where Noah established his first post-flood settlement. However, these elaborations represent later interpretive developments rather than elements present in the original Mesopotamian or early Hebrew flood narratives. A crucial episode that appears in all versions of the flood story is the hero's offering of sacrifice after emerging from the boat and the gods' reaction to this sacrifice. The Gilgamesh account provides vivid imagery. Utnapishtim makes an offering on the peak of the mountain, setting out 7 and 7 cult vessels and heaping up sweet-smelling cane, cedar and myrtle. The text states that, quote, 46, the sacrifice scene, reveals fundamental aspects of Mesopotamian theology regarding divine human relations and the nature of religious offerings. The description of gods gathering _quote_47_ around the sacrifice, while initially striking modern readers as undignified, actually conveys profound theological meaning. During the flood, when all humanity was destroyed, the gods received no offerings. The Mesopotamian religious system was fundamentally reciprocal. Humans provided gods with offerings and worship, while gods provided humans with protection, fertility, and cosmic order. The cessation of offerings during the flood meant the gods experienced genuine deprivation. The specific materials Utnapishtim uses for his offering demonstrate careful attention to ritual propriety. The text specifies, quote, 48 aromatic woods and plants that produced fragrant smoke when burned. Cedar, imported to Mesopotamia from the mountains of Lebanon at considerable expense, held particular value in ritual contexts. Its pleasant aroma when burned made it ideal for offerings meant to please divine senses. Myrtle, another aromatic plant, was associated with purification and sacred spaces. The combination of these materials created smoke that was both fragrant and symbolically pure. The specification of _49 reflects the sacred significance of the number 7 in Mesopotamian numerology. The doubling of 7 to 14 vessels created a ritual arrangement that emphasized completeness and divine perfection. These cult vessels, specialized containers used for libations and offerings, would have contained various substances, oil, wine, beer, milk, that were poured out as offerings. The multiplicity of vessels and variety of offerings demonstrated the comprehensiveness of Utnapishtim's gratitude and his understanding of proper ritual procedure. The physical positioning of the sacrifice on the peak of the mountain placed it at the highest accessible point, closest to heaven where the gods dwelt. This elevation symbolically reduced the distance between human offerer and divine recipients, facilitating the sacrifice's ascent to the divine realm. The smoke from the burning aromatics rose into the sky, creating a visible and olfactory connection between earth and heaven. Ancient Near Eastern peoples understood sacrificial smoke as the mechanism by which offerings reached the gods. The visible ascent of smoke demonstrated that the offering had been transmitted successfully from human to divine domains. The gods' eager response to the sacrifice, described as gathering like flies, reveals their genuine need for the resumption of human worship. This anthropomorphic portrayal of divine hunger and enthusiasm subverts typical hierarchical assumptions about divine-human relations. The gods are not entirely self-sufficient and superior, but rather depend on human offerings for their sustenance and satisfaction. This mutual dependence created the foundation for the covenantal relationship between gods and humans in Mesopotamian theology. Each party needed the other for optimal existence. The text makes explicit the gods' deprivation during the flood through the mouth of the mother goddess Nintu, who laments, quote, 52. Her regret emphasizes that the gods' decision to destroy humanity eliminated their own worshippers, cutting off the source of offerings that sustained divine existence. The Atrahasis version elaborates on the gods' response to resumed offerings, describing how they clustered around the sacrifice, quote, 53, and how they were, quote, 54 and, quote, 55. These visceral descriptions of divine need humanize the gods while simultaneously explaining their change of heart regarding humanity's destruction. Having experienced the consequences of eliminating their worshippers, the gods recognize that human survival served divine interests. The resumption of sacrifice demonstrated that a new equilibrium could be established between divine and human realms, based on mutual recognition of interdependence. The sacrifice also served apotropaic functions, warding off potential divine anger and establishing protective relationships. By making offerings immediately upon emerging from the vessel, Utnapishtim demonstrated proper piety and gratitude, establishing himself as a worthy survivor who understood and would maintain appropriate relations with the divine realm. The sacrifice essentially inaugurated the post-flood world order, setting the precedent for how humans would relate to gods in the renewed creation. Different scholarly interpretations have been proposed for understanding the theological implications of the sacrifice scene. Some scholars view it as evidence of Mesopotamian materialism in religious thought, with gods portrayed as dependent on physical sustenance provided through offerings. Others interpret it as sophisticated metaphorical theology, with the anthropomorphic descriptions serving as vivid imagery to convey abstract concepts about divine human relations. Still others see it as preserving authentic ancient Near Eastern theological concepts that differed fundamentally from later monotheistic frameworks. The biblical flood narrative preserves the sacrifice episode but modifies its theological implications to suit monotheistic theology. Genesis describes Noah building an altar and offering burnt offerings of clean animals and birds, with Yahweh smelling the pleasing odour and resolving never again to curse the ground or destroy all living creatures. The biblical version maintains the sacrifice as pivotal to divine reconciliation with humanity, but eliminates the polytheistic elements and the portrayal of divine dependence on offerings. The aftermath of the flood includes a dramatic confrontation between the gods that reveals theological tensions about divine justice and the value of human life. When Enlil, the god who instigated the flood, arrives at the mountain and sees that survivors exist, he becomes furious. The text describes his reaction. Has some living soul escaped? No man was to survive the destruction. This rage reveals Enlil's intention was complete annihilation. Enlil's anger upon discovering survivors demonstrates that the Divine Council's decision to send the flood was meant to be final and total. The survival of even a single human family represented a fundamental failure of the flood's purpose from Enlil's perspective. His fury was not simply emotional reaction, but reflected theological principles about divine authority and the binding nature of divine decrees. When the assembly of gods decided on humanity's destruction, and all gods swore oaths to maintain secrecy and ensure completion, Enlil understood this as an irrevocable decision that should admit no exceptions. The text describes Enlil's accusatory questioning. Quote, 58. The phrasing reveals Enlil's assumption that the survival of humans could only result from divine betrayal. Someone among the gods must have violated their oath and warned humanity. The survival itself constituted evidence of divine conspiracy against the council's decree. Enlil's rage therefore targeted not primarily the human survivors, but rather the deity responsible for enabling their survival. Ea's response to Enlil's accusation demonstrates the sophisticated rhetorical skill attributed to the god of wisdom. The text presents different versions of Ea's defense in different recensions, but all versions show Ea deflecting Enlil's anger while defending his action. In the Gilgamesh version, Ea does not deny his responsibility, but rather argues that Enlil's decision was unjust and disproportionate. Ea states, quote, 59. This speech articulates principles of proportional justice that challenge Enlil's absolutist approach. He argues that punishment should be targeted and measured. Sinners should bear consequences proportional to their specific sins, but punishment should not extend to the innocent, nor should it be so severe as to eliminate possibility of rehabilitation. The terms be lenient and be patient invoke virtues of wisdom and restraint, suggesting that true divine power includes the capacity for mercy and gradual correction, rather than only the power of overwhelming destruction. He continues by noting that other methods existed for controlling human population without resorting to total destruction. Instead of your bringing on the deluge, would that a lion had risen up to diminish the people? Instead of your bringing on the deluge, would that a wolf had risen up to diminish the people? Instead of your bringing on the deluge, would that famine had risen up to devastate the land? Instead of your bringing on the deluge, would that pestilence had risen up to devastate the land? Each alternative represents a natural check on population that would reduce human numbers without eliminating humanity entirely. These alternative population controls that Ea proposes reflect actual threats that ancient Mesopotamian populations faced: predation by wild animals, famine from crop failures, and epidemic disease. Each represented serious dangers but allowed for human response, adaptation, and survival. By listing these alternatives, Ea implicitly argues that Enlil's flood represented an excessive response to a problem that had less drastic solutions. The wisdom god's argument appeals to reason and proportionality rather than power and authority. Ea also deflects direct responsibility by claiming that he did not explicitly reveal the god's plan to Utnapishtim. Instead, Ea states, quote, 63. This legalistic defense maintains that Ea technically kept his oath. He spoke to a wall, not to a human, and if the human happened to overhear and interpret correctly, that was the human's own wisdom rather than divine disclosure. This clever misdirection demonstrates Ea's characteristic cunning and his ability to work within divine law while subverting its intent. The text indicates that other gods supported Ea's position, recognizing the wisdom of his arguments, even if they could not openly side against Enlil before the chief god acknowledged error. Nintu, the mother goddess, had already expressed regret over the flood before Ea's speech, lamenting her role in destroying her own creation. The divine consensus was shifting from support for total destruction to recognition that survival of some humans served a divine interest better than complete annihilation. Enlil's response to Ea's defense marks a crucial turning point in divine-human relations. Rather than maintaining his anger and demanding the survivors' deaths, Enlil accepts the fait accompli and proceeds to transform the situation from one of divine failure into one of divine magnanimity. This shift from rage to acceptance demonstrates either Enlil's recognition of the validity of Ea's arguments, or his pragmatic understanding that the flood could not be repeated to finish the job, making acceptance of survivors the only viable option. The confrontation between Enlil and Ea represents a theological dialogue about the proper exercise of divine power and the value of human life. Enlil embodies absolute authority and the principle that divine decisions once made should be executed without exception. Ea represents wisdom, proportionality, and the recognition that power should be tempered by understanding of consequences and consideration of alternatives. The narrative's sympathetic portrayal of Ea and its demonstration that his position ultimately prevailed suggests that the composers of the flood narrative endorsed wisdom and mercy over absolute power. The conclusion of the flood narrative in Gilgamesh involves Enlil's reconciliation with the situation and his granting of a unique reward to Utnapishtim and his wife. Taking them by the hand, Enlil touches their foreheads and blesses them, declaring, "Hitherto Utnapishtim has been but human. Henceforth Utnapishtim and his wife shall be like unto us gods. Utnapishtim shall dwell far away at the mouth of the rivers." The granting of immortality to Utnapishtim represents an extraordinary transformation that the text presents as absolutely unique and unrepeatable. By declaring that Utnapishtim and his wife shall be like unto us gods, Enlil elevates them from mortal to divine status, fundamentally changing their nature. This transformation goes beyond simply extending their lifespans. It removes them from the category of mortal beings subject to death, and places them in the category of eternal beings who exist outside normal temporal limitations. The physical gesture accompanying the blessing, Enlil taking Utnapishtim and his wife by the hand and touching their foreheads, suggests a ritual of transformation. In Mesopotamian religious practice, touching the forehead or head conveyed blessing and power. The combination of physical contact with the pronouncement of transformation indicates that immortality required both ritual action and divine decree. This was not automatic reward, but deliberate elevation requiring the chief god's direct intervention and explicit authorization. The condition attached to this immortality, that Utnapishtim shall dwell _66, removed him from normal human society and geography. The _67 refers to the point where the Tigris and Euphrates meet and flow into the Persian Gulf, a location at the edge of the known world from a Mesopotamian perspective. This distant location represented a liminal space between the earthly and divine realms, suitable for beings who are no longer fully human, but not quite fully divine. The geographical exile accompanying immortality served multiple narrative purposes. It explained why Utnapishtim, despite being immortal, played no role in subsequent human history. He was physically removed from the world of mortal concerns. It also established that immortality came at the cost of separation from human community and normal human life. Utnapishtim gained eternal life but lost participation in the ongoing human story, making his immortality a mixed blessing rather than pure reward. The uniqueness of Utnapishtim's immortality receives emphasis through its narrative context within the larger Epic of Gilgamesh. The entire epic concerns Gilgamesh's quest for eternal life following the death of his friend Enkidu. Gilgamesh undertakes extraordinary labours and overcomes impossible obstacles to reach Utnapishtim, hoping to learn the secret of immortality. Utnapishtim's flood story, told to Gilgamesh as explanation of how he achieved eternal life, demonstrates that immortality resulted from unique, unrepeatable circumstances rather than from a repeatable procedure or achievement. After telling his story, Utnapishtim makes explicit that Gilgamesh cannot replicate these circumstances. But now, who will assemble the gods for your sake, so that you may find the life you seek? This rhetorical question emphasizes that the assembly of gods that decided to grant Utnapishtim immortality was a one-time event that will not recur. No future human, however heroic or deserving, can expect similar treatment, because the specific conditions that led to Utnapishtim's elevation, his role in preserving life through the flood, and Enlil's subsequent remorse, cannot be duplicated. Utnapishtim does provide Gilgamesh with one test that might demonstrate worthiness for immortality, remaining awake for 7 days and 7 nights. This test, which Gilgamesh immediately fails by falling asleep, demonstrates that even basic requirements for divine-level existence exceed human capabilities. The 7-day sleeplessness test paralleled the 7 days of the floodstorm, suggesting that enduring conscious awareness through complete temporal cycles represented a minimum divine attribute that humans could not sustain. As consolation for failing the sleeplessness test, Utnapishtim reveals the existence of a plant that grows at the bottom of the Apsu that can restore youth, though not grant immortality. Gilgamesh successfully retrieves this plant, planning to use it to rejuvenate the elders of Uruk. However, a serpent steals and consumes the plant while Gilgamesh bathes in a pool, demonstrating that even this limited form of life extension was not meant for human possession. The serpent's theft and subsequent shedding of its skin transferred the plant's rejuvenating properties to snakes, explaining their ability to renew themselves through molting, while humans remained subject to irreversible aging. The narrative arc from Utnapishtim's immortality through Gilgamesh's failed quest establishes a clear theological position. Immortality is not available to humans through any achievable means. The one exception proves the rule. Utnapishtim's unique elevation resulted from completely unrepeatable circumstances and came at the cost of removal from human community. The message to Gilgamesh, and through him to all humans, is that mortality is the fundamental human condition that must be accepted rather than overcome. Our entire understanding of Mesopotamian flood narratives depends on the remarkable preservation and eventual decipherment of cuneiform tablets. Cuneiform, meaning _quote, _69_ was a writing system developed by the Sumerians around 3200 BC and adopted by subsequent Mesopotamian cultures, including the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians. The script was created by pressing a reed stylus into soft clay tablets, which were then dried in the sun or baked in kilns. The invention of cuneiform writing represented one of humanity's most significant intellectual achievements, transforming human society by enabling the recording of information independent of human memory. The earliest cuneiform texts were administrative documents recording economic transactions, quantities of grain, numbers of livestock, labour assignments. These proto-cuneiform tablets from Uruk, dating to approximately 3200 BC, used pictographic symbols that represented concrete objects and quantities. Over subsequent centuries, these pictographs became increasingly abstract and stylized, evolving into the wedge-shaped signs that characterize mature cuneiform. The transition from pictographic to cuneiform script involved fundamental changes in how writing encoded language. Early pictographs represented things directly. A pictograph of a sheep meant sheep. As the system developed, signs came to represent sounds rather than just objects, enabling the writing of grammatical elements, abstract concepts, and proper names. This phonetic dimension transformed writing from a limited accounting tool into a system capable of recording complete linguistic utterances including poetry, narrative, legal codes, and scientific observations. The physical characteristics of cuneiform tablets contributed significantly to their preservation. Clay tablets, when baked, become extremely durable, resistant to water, decay, and many forms of environmental degradation. Tablets that were accidentally baked when buildings burned often preserved better than those deliberately dried, as high-temperature firing created hardness approaching that of pottery. Many of the tablets excavated from ancient libraries survived because the buildings housing them were destroyed by fire. The catastrophe that destroyed the structures actually preserved the texts they contained. The Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, discovered by Austin Henry Layard in the 1840s, represents the most significant source of cuneiform literary texts. Ashurbanipal, who ruled the Neo-Assyrian Empire from 668 to 627 BC, commissioned the creation of a comprehensive library containing copies of texts from throughout Mesopotamian history. Royal scribes travelled across the empire collecting tablets and creating copies of texts from temple libraries, royal archives, and private collections. The result was a repository containing tens of thousands of tablets covering every genre of cuneiform literature: myths, epics, hymns, prayers, omens, medical texts, mathematical tables, astronomical observations, and administrative records. When Nineveh was sacked and burned in 612 BC during the collapse of the Assyrian Empire, the fires that destroyed the city baked the library tablets, hardening them and ensuring their survival. These tablets lay buried in the ruins for over 2 millennia until Layard's excavations brought them to light. The British Museum acquired the bulk of the Nineveh tablets, where they became the foundation for understanding Mesopotamian civilization and literature. The decipherment of cuneiform represented an intellectual achievement comparable to the original invention of the script. The process began in the early 19th century with the work of Georg Friedrich Grotefend, a German schoolteacher who in 1802 made the first successful decipherment of Old Persian cuneiform inscriptions. Grotefend worked with trilingual inscriptions from Persepolis that presented the same text in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform. By comparing these parallel texts and making educated guesses about royal names and titles, Grotefan identified the phonetic values of several cuneiform signs. The breakthrough in Babylonian cuneiform decipherment came through the work of Henry Rawlinson, a British army officer and diplomat who copied the massive trilingual Behistun inscription from a cliff face in western Iran during the 1830s and 1840s. This inscription, carved on the orders of the Persian king Darius I around 500 BC, presented a lengthy text in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. Rawlinson's complete copy of this inscription, achieved under dangerous conditions that required hanging from the cliff face, provided the key text for deciphering Babylonian cuneiform. By the 1850s, scholars including Rawlinson, Edward Hincks, Jules Opper and William Henry Fox Talbot had independently deciphered sufficient cuneiform to translate Babylonian texts with reasonable accuracy. The validity of their decipherments was demonstrated in 1857 when the Royal Asiatic Society conducted a famous test. Identical copies of a newly discovered inscription were given to Rawlinson, Hincks, Oppert and Talbot separately. Each scholar produced an independent translation, and when these translations were compared, they proved substantially identical, confirming that cuneiform had been genuinely deciphered rather than wishfully interpreted. The application of cuneiform decipherment to literary texts from Ashurbanipal's library proceeded rapidly. George Smith, working at the British Museum under the direction of Henry Rawlinson, was assigned to catalogue and translate tablets from Nineveh. Smith had taught himself cuneiform while working as a banknote engraver, displaying such aptitude that the museum hired him as an assistant. His systematic work through the Nineveh collection led to his 1872 discovery of the flood tablet, the moment when Mesopotamian flood traditions became known to the modern world. The moment when George Smith deciphered the flood tablet in 1872 created a sensation in Victorian Britain that extended far beyond academic circles. Smith, a former banknote engraver who had taught himself cuneiform, was working as an assistant at the British Museum when he encountered the tablet that would make him famous. His reaction to discovering the flood account was described by colleagues as extraordinarily emotional. He reportedly jumped up, began pacing excitedly, and in his agitation started removing his coat and waistcoat. Smith's background made his achievement particularly remarkable. Born in 1840 in London to a working-class family, Smith received only basic education before being apprenticed to a banknote engraving firm at age 14. The precision and attention to detail required for engraving currency notes proved excellent preparation for the meticulous work of copying and analysing cuneiform signs. Smith spent his lunch hours at the British Museum studying the Assyrian galleries, teaching himself to read cuneiform through careful examination of the inscriptions and published translations. His dedication and obvious talent came to the attention of Samuel Birch, the keeper of Oriental antiquities, who hired Smith as an assistant in 1867. Smith's assignment was to sort, catalogue and begin translating the vast backlog of tablets from Nineveh that had accumulated since the 1840s excavations. The work required painstaking examination of thousands of fragmentary tablets, identifying joins between pieces and gradually reconstructing texts from scattered fragments. Most tablets had broken into multiple pieces during their burial or excavation, creating a massive three-dimensional puzzle requiring both linguistic knowledge and spatial reasoning. On the 3rd of December 1872, Smith was working through tablets from the 11th series of a text that had been identified as the Epic of Gilgamesh. As he deciphered the cuneiform signs, he realized he was reading an account of a great flood strikingly similar to the biblical narrative. The tablet described a man named Utnapishtim who survived a divinely sent deluge by building a boat and preserving animal life. The parallels to Genesis were unmistakable. The divine warning, the boat construction, the flood's destruction of humanity, the release of birds to test for dry land, the sacrifice after disembarking. Smith's colleague E. A. Wallace Budge later described the scene, quote, 70. Whether Smith actually removed clothing or merely loosened his collar in agitation has been debated by biographers, but all accounts agree his excitement was extraordinary. This emotional reaction was not mere personal enthusiasm, but reflected Smith's recognition of the discovery's profound implications for Victorian understanding of biblical origins. On December 3rd, 1872, just days after his private discovery, Smith presented his findings to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London. The audience included leading biblical scholars, theologians, and Orientalists who recognized immediately the significance of Smith's translation. Here was physical proof that flood stories predated the biblical account by over 1,000 years, demonstrating that the Genesis narrative had Mesopotamian predecessors. For Victorian Britain, where biblical authority was being challenged by geological discoveries and evolutionary theory, Smith's discovery added another dimension to debates about Scripture's historical reliability. The Daily Telegraph newspaper, recognising the public fascination with Smith's discovery, offered the extraordinary sum of 1,000 guineas to sponsor an expedition to Nineveh to search for missing portions of the flood tablet. Smith's translation had revealed that several crucial lines were missing where the tablet was damaged, leaving gaps in the narrative. The newspaper's sponsorship of archaeological research was unprecedented and demonstrated the public's intense interest in discoveries relating to biblical history. Smith departed for Mesopotamia in January 1873, reaching the ruins of Nineveh in May. This site had not been systematically excavated since Layard's work 25 years earlier, and Smith faced considerable challenges including extreme heat, limited resources, and bureaucratic obstacles from Ottoman authorities. Nevertheless, he organised a team of local workers and began excavating in the area where Ashurbanipal's library had been discovered. Remarkably, within 5 days of beginning excavation, Smith's team uncovered a fragment that proved to be part of the missing section of the flood tablet. The fragment contained 17 lines of text that filled one of the crucial gaps in the narrative, including details about the flood's onset and the construction of the boat. The speed of this discovery seemed almost miraculous, though it likely reflected the fact that Smith was working in deposits that had already yielded thousands of tablets, making the discovery of additional fragments statistically probable. Smith made 2 additional expeditions to Mesopotamia in 1874 and 1876, during which he discovered thousands more tablets and made significant contributions to understanding Assyrian history and literature. However, his work was cut short by his untimely death in August 1876 at age 36. Smith contracted dysentery while travelling from Baghdad to Aleppo during his 3rd expedition and died before reaching proper medical care. His body was buried in Aleppo, far from the London where he had made his greatest discoveries. Smith's work established the foundation for understanding Mesopotamian flood traditions and their relationship to biblical narratives. His publications, including, quote, 71 published in 1876, made cuneiform flood texts accessible to general readers and scholars alike. The book became a bestseller, demonstrating public fascination with archaeological discoveries that illuminated biblical backgrounds. Smith's translations, while requiring refinement by later scholars as cuneiform studies advanced, proved fundamentally accurate and provided the basis for all subsequent work on the Epic of Gilgamesh. The impact of Smith's discovery extended beyond academic Assyriology to influence broader theological and cultural debates. Liberal theologians welcomed the evidence of Mesopotamian flood traditions as supporting their arguments that biblical narratives drew from common ancient Near Eastern cultural heritage, rather than representing unique divine revelation. Conservative scholars responded by arguing that both Mesopotamian and biblical accounts derived from memories of an actual historical flood. With the biblical version preserving the most accurate theological interpretation of the event, the public fascination with Smith's discovery generated increased support for archaeological work in Mesopotamia and accelerated the decipherment and publication of cuneiform texts. museums and universities expanded their collections of Mesopotamian artifacts and tablets, recognizing both the scholarly value and public interest in these materials. The British Museum, the Louvre, the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and other institutions organized expeditions to sites across Mesopotamia, uncovering additional tablets that provided ever more detailed understanding of ancient civilization. The Mesopotamian flood narratives clearly influenced later traditions, most notably the biblical account of Noah found in Genesis chapters 6 through 9. The parallels are too numerous and specific to be coincidental. A divinely sent flood to destroy humanity, one righteous man warned by God, detailed boat-building instructions, the preservation of animal species, the sending of birds to test for dry land, the mountain landing, the post-flood sacrifice, and the divine promise not to repeat such destruction. The process by which Mesopotamian flood traditions reached Hebrew authors has been extensively debated by scholars. The most straightforward explanation proposes direct transmission during the Babylonian exile of the 6th century BC, when substantial Jewish populations lived in Mesopotamia and would have encountered local flood traditions. However, the similarities between Genesis and the Mesopotamian accounts suggest borrowing from versions much older than the Neo-Babylonian period, pointing to earlier cultural contact between Israelite and Mesopotamian traditions. The Genesis flood narrative, while clearly related to Mesopotamian versions, adapts the story to monotheistic theology in ways that transform its meaning. The most obvious change is the replacement of the polytheistic divine council with a single God who decides alone to send the flood. This eliminates the divine conflict between Enlil and Ea that drives the Mesopotamian versions, simplifying the theological framework but also removing the ethical debates about justice and mercy that make the Mesopotamian versions philosophically complex. Genesis also provides explicit moral justification for the flood that is largely absent from Mesopotamian versions. Genesis chapter 6 states that the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. This moral framework positions the flood as punishment for human sin rather than response to divine irritation with noise or overpopulation. The emphasis on human wickedness makes the flood comprehensible within a framework of divine justice, though it raises theological difficulties about the deaths of children and animals who bore no moral responsibility. The dimensions of Noah's Ark differ significantly from those specified for Utnapishtim's vessel. Genesis provides specific measurements: 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high, roughly 140 meters by 23 meters by 14 meters. This creates a rectangular vessel with proportions approximating a modern cargo ship, rather than the cube described in Gilgamesh. The biblical dimensions are more practically suited to floating, suggesting either that Hebrew authors modified an impractical design, or that they were working from different source traditions than those preserved in the standard Babylonian Gilgamesh. The duration of the flood differs between Genesis and Mesopotamian accounts. While Gilgamesh describes 6 days and 7 nights of storm, Genesis extends the catastrophe over a much longer period: 40 days and nights of rain, followed by 150 days before waters began receding, with the entire sequence from boarding the ark to disembarking spanning over a year. This extension transforms the flood from a brief catastrophic event to a prolonged ordeal requiring extended survival within the vessel. The bird testing sequence in Genesis shows both similarities and differences from the Mesopotamian version. Noah releases a raven first, which went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. This description parallels the Gilgamesh raven that does not return but adds the detail that it flew back and forth, perhaps returning periodically to the ark while feeding on floating carrion. Noah then releases a dove 3 times at 7-day intervals. The first release produces no result, the second brings back an olive leaf, and the third results in the dove not returning. The olive leaf detail, absent from Mesopotamian versions, provides botanical evidence of vegetative recovery and adds agricultural symbolism. Olive trees held particular importance in ancient Israelite economy and culture, making the olive leaf a culturally appropriate symbol of renewed fertility and divine blessing. The threefold dove release creates a progressive narrative structure absent from the single releases in Gilgamesh, building tension through repeated testing before final confirmation of dry land. The post-flood covenant between God and Noah represents a major innovation absent from Mesopotamian versions. Genesis describes God establishing a covenant never again to destroy the earth by flood, with the rainbow serving as a sign of this promise. This covenant theology transforms the flood from a chaotic divine action that even the gods regretted into a one-time event that will never recur, providing assurance against future cosmic catastrophe. The rainbow's natural occurrence after rain creates a visible reminder of divine promise accessible to all observers. The absence of immortality for Noah contrasts sharply with Utnapishtim's reward. Noah lives 950 years according to Genesis, an extraordinarily long lifespan but still finite. He remains fundamentally mortal, dying naturally rather than being transformed into a divine being. This preserves the categorical distinction between human and divine that monotheistic theology requires. Noah's descendants populate the entire post-flood earth according to Genesis, with detailed genealogies tracing all nations back to his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10 provides an ethnographic catalogue claiming to explain the origins of all known peoples as descendants of Noah's sons. This genealogical framework served ancient Israelite interests by positioning their ancestors within a universal history, while explaining the diversity of nations and languages. The subsequent Tower of Babel narrative in Genesis chapter 11 provides an etiology for linguistic diversity, explaining how Noah's unified descendants came to speak different languages and disperse across the earth. Scholarly analysis of the Genesis flood narrative has identified multiple source layers that were combined by later editors. The documentary hypothesis, while debated in its specifics, recognizes that the biblical flood story contains doublets and inconsistencies suggesting compilation from different sources. For example, Genesis provides two different chronologies for the flood, specifies different numbers of clean and unclean animals to be preserved, and uses different divine names in different sections. These textual features suggest that Hebrew authors knew multiple flood traditions and combined them into a composite narrative. The relationship between Mesopotamian and biblical flood narratives demonstrates the complexity of ancient Near Eastern cultural transmission, rather than simple borrowing. The process involved adaptation and transformation of received traditions to suit different theological and cultural contexts. The Hebrew authors who incorporated flood traditions into Genesis were not merely copying Mesopotamian sources, but were actively reshaping those traditions to express monotheistic theology and to address the specific concerns of their community. While Mesopotamian sources provide the earliest written flood narratives, similar stories appear in cultures worldwide, from ancient Greece to India to the Americas. The Greek myth of Deucalion and Pyrrha describes a flood sent by Zeus to destroy the corrupt Bronze Age, with only the pious King Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha surviving by building a chest or ark. After 9 days, their vessel came to rest on Mount Parnassus, and they repopulated the earth. The Greek flood tradition, preserved in multiple classical sources including works by Apollodorus, Ovid, and Pindar, shares structural similarities with Mesopotamian and biblical accounts, despite developing independently within Greek mythology. Deucalion, son of Prometheus, received warning from his father about Zeus's plan to flood the earth. Following Prometheus's advice, Deucalion constructed a chest or wooden box in which he and his wife Pyrrha took refuge. The flood lasted 9 days, after which their vessel grounded on Mount Parnassus in central Greece. The repopulation method in the Greek version differs strikingly from both Mesopotamian and biblical accounts. rather than simply having children who multiply naturally. Deucalion and Pyrrha were instructed by the oracle at Delphi to throw the bones of their mother behind them as they walked. Interpreting __quote_74 as Mother Earth, they threw stones over their shoulders. The stones Deucalion threw became men, while those Pyrrha threw became women, magically creating a new human population. This creative solution to repopulation reflects Greek mythological themes about the blurred boundaries between animate and inanimate matter. Hindu traditions preserve flood narratives in the Puranas, particularly the Matsya Purana, which describes how the god Vishnu appeared to the righteous King Manu in the form of a fish and warned him of an impending deluge. Vishnu instructed Manu to build a large boat and load it with seeds of all plants and pairs of all animals. When the flood came, Vishnu in his fish form pulled Manu's boat through the waters to safety on a mountain peak in the Himalayas. After the waters receded, Manu became the progenitor of the new human race. The Hindu flood narrative includes unique elements reflecting Indian cultural and religious contexts. The fish avatar of Vishnu represents one of the deity's 10 incarnations through which he periodically intervenes to preserve cosmic order. The preservation of plant seeds alongside animals emphasizes agricultural renewal, and the vegetarian dietary preference is important in Hindu culture. The location of the mountain in the Himalayas appropriately positions the flood within Indian sacred geography. Chinese flood traditions, preserved in texts including the Classic of History and various commentaries, describe a great flood during the reign of Emperor Yao that covered the earth and reached to heaven. The flood lasted for many years until the hero Yu the Great successfully controlled the waters through engineering projects that created channels to direct flood waters to the sea. Unlike Western flood narratives where divine intervention ends the catastrophe, the Chinese tradition emphasizes human technical skill and persistence in overcoming the disaster. Yu's flood control work required 13 years of constant effort, during which he passed his own house 3 times without stopping to visit his family, demonstrating the Confucian values of duty and self-sacrifice. His success in controlling the flood led to his being chosen as emperor, founding the Jia dynasty. The emphasis on engineering solutions and the rewarding of technical competence reflects distinctive Chinese cultural values while preserving the basic flood tradition. Native American flood traditions appear across numerous tribal cultures from the Arctic to South America. The Hopi of the American Southwest preserve accounts of multiple world destructions, including flood, with survivors taking refuge in hollow reeds that floated on the waters. The Ojibwe of the Great Lakes region describe Nana Bojo surviving a flood on a log with various animals, then sending birds to search for earth, with a muskrat finally succeeding in bringing up mud from which the world was recreated. The Inca of South America preserved traditions of a great flood sent by the god Viracocha to destroy a corrupt earlier humanity. 1 man and 1 woman survived by taking refuge in a cave or floating in a hollow drum, after which they emerged to repopulate the earth. Archaeological evidence from South America includes numerous sites showing sudden abandonment and evidence of massive flooding in the Andes, suggesting these traditions may preserve memories of actual catastrophic events. Australian Aboriginal Dreamtime stories include flood narratives from multiple tribal groups. The Bundjalung people of New South Wales preserve accounts of a great flood called Ngurunda that destroyed the previous world when the rainbow serpent stirred the waters. Survivors took refuge on mountains that became islands, from which they later descended to populate the renewed earth. The antiquity of Aboriginal cultural traditions, extending back tens of thousands of years, makes these flood accounts particularly significant for understanding the potential depth of flood traditions in human cultural memory. The global distribution of flood narratives has generated extensive scholarly debate about their origin and significance. The uniformitarian explanation proposes that flooding is a sufficiently common natural disaster that cultures independently developed flood narratives without requiring common origin or historical basis. This interpretation emphasizes that most ancient civilizations developed near rivers or coasts, where catastrophic flooding occurred periodically, providing experiential basis for flood stories. The diffusionist explanation argues that the widespread distribution of flood narratives reflects dissemination from a common origin, possibly Mesopotamia, through cultural contact and migration. This interpretation notes the structural similarities between geographically separated flood traditions, including specific details like bird testing and mountain landing that seem too specific to arise independently. However, diffusion requires demonstrating plausible contact routes and timing, which proves difficult for some widely separated cultures. The catastrophist explanation proposes that flood narratives preserve memories of actual global or near-global catastrophic flooding that occurred in prehistory, possibly during the Younger Dryas period or the rapid sea level rise following the last ice age. This interpretation gained support from geological evidence of dramatic flooding events and rapid climate changes that would have affected human populations worldwide. However, it requires assuming oral transmission of traditions across many millennia, which challenges conventional understanding of cultural memory duration. Beyond questions of historical basis or literary influence, it's crucial to consider what the flood narratives meant within their original Mesopotamian cultural context. These were not simply entertaining stories or historical chronicles, but rather texts that grappled with fundamental questions about the relationship between gods and humans, divine justice, human mortality, and the fragility of civilization. The flood narratives functioned as theodicy, attempting to explain why gods who created humanity would seek to destroy it. The stories present divine frustration with human noise, overpopulation, and general troublesomeness, suggesting that even well-intentioned creation can produce unintended consequences requiring drastic correction. This theological framework acknowledges divine imperfection. The gods make mistakes, experience regret, and must adapt their plans when initial strategies fail. This contrasts sharply with later monotheistic theology that requires divine omniscience and infallibility. The emphasis on the gods' regret during and after the flood reveals sophisticated theological thinking about the limits of divine power and foresight. When the Mesopotamian gods unleash the flood, they are terrified by its intensity and cower like dogs. This portrayal of divine fear demonstrates that even gods can be overwhelmed by forces they initiate, suggesting that cosmic order is fragile and that destructive forces once unleashed may exceed the control of those who released them. The gods' hunger during the flood and their eager response to resumed offerings after it ends reveals divine dependence on human worship, creating a relationship of mutual need rather than one-sided human dependence. The flood narratives also address questions about civilizational continuity and knowledge transmission across catastrophic disruptions. The preservation of the flood hero, along with craftsmen, seeds, and animals, ensures that post-flood civilization can rebuild rapidly, rather than starting from primitive conditions. This narrative element reflects Mesopotamian awareness that their own civilization depended on accumulated knowledge, and that loss of this knowledge would be as catastrophic as physical destruction. The stories validate the importance of preserving wisdom and maintaining continuity with the past. The role of Enki as humanity's protector provided theological support for the temple system and priestly authority. Ea's temples, particularly at Eridu, claimed special status as centres where divine wisdom was accessible to humans through properly trained priests. The flood narratives demonstrated that human survival depended on maintaining proper relationships with protective deities and heeding their warnings transmitted through authorized channels. This legitimized priestly mediation between divine and human realms. The flood stories also served political functions by connecting royal authority to divine favor. Kings who claimed descent from or special relationship to the flood hero could position themselves as inheritors of antediluvian wisdom and divinely sanctioned authority. The Sumerian king list's division of history into antediluvian and post-diluvian periods created a chronological framework that organized political legitimacy, with dynasties claiming greater antiquity, thereby claiming greater authority. The narratives addressed existential questions about the fragility of civilization and the ever-present possibility of collapse. For Mesopotamian audiences living in urban environments dependent on complex irrigation systems and vulnerable to flooding, disease, and warfare, the flood story acknowledged that civilization existed precariously and could be destroyed catastrophically. The successful survival and rebuilding in the narrative provided hope that even after total catastrophe, renewal remained possible through combination of divine favor, human wisdom, and preservation of essential knowledge. The flood hero's achievement of immortality, while explicitly described as unique and unrepeatable, provided a mythological model for transcending human limitations. Even though Gilgamesh fails in his quest to achieve similar immortality, the existence of Utnapishtim as proof that immortality was possible for at least one human prevented mortality from being absolute and inevitable. This narrative element allowed for hope of exceptional transcendence while maintaining mortality as the normal human condition. The text's sophisticated exploration of divine human relationships demonstrates that Mesopotamian theology grapples seriously with ethical questions about power, justice, and responsibility. Ea's arguments for proportional punishment rather than total destruction articulate principles that would later appear in legal codes and philosophical ethics. The tension between Enlil's authoritarian approach and Ea's wisdom-based approach reflects ongoing cultural debates about the proper exercise of power and the relationship between force and intelligence in governance. Contemporary scholarship on Mesopotamian flood narratives employs multiple methodological approaches, from traditional philology and textual analysis to archaeological investigation and comparative mythology. The consensus view holds that these narratives represent complex literary compositions that drew on genuine cultural memories of catastrophic flooding while serving primarily theological and philosophical purposes. Textual analysis has revealed that the flood narratives underwent substantial evolution over the centuries of their transmission. Comparison between Old Babylonian and Standard. Babylonian versions of the same text show systematic modifications, additions, and theological development. The Gilgamesh flood narrative represents a relatively late stage in this evolution, incorporating the flood story into a larger epic framework that uses it to explore themes of mortality and human limitations. Earlier versions like Atrahasis and the Eridu Genesis show the flood story as independent narrative with different emphases. Archaeological research continues to investigate evidence for historical flooding events that might have inspired the traditions. While Leonard Woolley's initial claims about discovering Noah's flood proved overstated, the accumulated evidence from multiple sites confirms that catastrophic flooding occurred repeatedly in ancient Mesopotamia. The challenge for scholars is determining whether any specific archaeological flood horizon correlates with the narrative traditions, or whether the stories represent composite memories of multiple events. Recent geological and climatic research has provided new context for understanding flood traditions through identification of the Younger Dryas period and other dramatic climate events that affected ancient Near Eastern populations. The rapid sea level rise following the last ice age, which inundated vast coastal plains and created the Persian Gulf in its current form, may have provided experiential basis for flood traditions preserved across millennia through oral transmission. Comparative mythology approaches examine flood narratives within broader frameworks of universal mythological patterns. Scholars including James George Fraser and Messier Eliade identified flood myths as examples of creation through destruction motifs that appear across cultures. These approaches seek to understand flood narratives as expressions of archetypal human concerns about cosmic order, renewal, and the relationship between civilization and chaos, rather than as historical chronicles. Anthropological perspectives examine how flood narratives function within societies that preserve them, serving to explain origins, validate social structures, provide moral instruction, and create shared cultural identity. The narratives encode values that cultures wish to transmit: piety, obedience, wisdom, proper worship, while explaining why the current world order exists in its present form. The survivor's special status validates hierarchies and authorities that claim descent or connection to him. Feminist scholarship has examined gender dynamics within flood narratives, noting that while the flood hero is consistently male, female figures play important roles, particularly the mother goddess who laments humanity's destruction. The inclusion of the hero's wife in receiving immortality, while she plays minimal active role in the narrative, raises questions about gender and divine favour in ancient theological frameworks. Recent scholarship has also examined how flood narratives construct masculinity through the hero's technical competence, piety, and ability to preserve civilization. Post-colonial approaches examine how European discovery and interpretation of Mesopotamian flood texts in the 19th century served colonial interests by positioning the Bible within a broader ancient Near Eastern context that European scholarship claimed authority to interpret. George Smith's discovery occurred during peak British imperial expansion, and archaeological work in Mesopotamia was deeply entangled with colonial administration and resource extraction. Critical examination of this history reveals how supposedly objective scholarship reflected and reinforced imperial power relations. Digital humanities methods are providing new tools for analysing cuneiform texts, including the flood narratives. Computational analysis of vocabulary, formulaic expressions, and narrative structure enables detection of patterns not visible through traditional reading. Database compilation of cuneiform texts enables comprehensive searching and comparison across the entire corpus. Three-dimensional scanning of damaged tablets allows virtual reconstruction and improved reading of deteriorated passages. Recent discoveries continue to add to the corpus of flood-related texts. Excavations in Iraq following the periods of instability have resumed at various sites, producing new tablets that refine understanding of textual transmission. The electronic publication of museum collections that were catalogued but never fully published has made additional versions of flood texts available to scholars. Each new text or fragment potentially clarifies ambiguities and provides additional context for interpreting the narratives. The integration of flood narratives into educational curricula has made these texts accessible to broader audiences beyond specialized scholars. The Epic of Gilgamesh appears regularly in world literature courses, introducing students to ancient Mesopotamian culture while raising questions about cultural transmission, literary influence, and the relationship between myth and history. Popular treatments of the flood story in documentaries and books continue to generate public interest in ancient Mesopotamia. Ongoing debates focus on questions that remain unresolved despite extensive study. The relationship between different versions of the flood story, whether they represent independent developments or derive from common sources, continues to generate scholarly discussion. The extent to which the narratives preserve historical memories versus representing pure literary invention remains contested. The mechanisms by which Mesopotamian traditions influenced biblical and other ancient flood accounts require further investigation, particularly given limited evidence for direct textual transmission in some cases. The significance of Mesopotamian flood narratives extends beyond their historical and literary importance to encompass their role in shaping Western cultural understanding of catastrophe, survival, and renewal. These ancient texts continue to resonate because they address fundamental human concerns about the fragility of civilization, the capriciousness of fate, and the possibility of surviving catastrophic destruction. As modern civilization faces potential catastrophic disruptions from climate change, pandemic disease, and technological risks, the ancient flood narratives provide both cautionary tales about civilization's vulnerability and hopeful narratives about the possibility of preservation and renewal through wisdom, preparation, and divine or natural favour. The evidence accumulated through our investigation of Mesopotamian flood narratives reveals a sophisticated literary and theological tradition that emerged in the world's earliest literate civilization and profoundly influenced subsequent cultural development across millennia. These texts, preserved on clay tablets buried for thousands of years and painstakingly deciphered by 19th and 20th century scholars, represent far more than ancient stories about catastrophic flooding. They constitute humanity's earliest written attempts to grapple with fundamental questions about divine justice, human mortality, civilizational fragility, and the possibility of renewal after catastrophe. The archaeological evidence demonstrates that catastrophic flooding was indeed a recurring reality in ancient Mesopotamia, where the unpredictable Tigris and Euphrates rivers periodically inundated settlements with devastating force. The flood deposits discovered at Ur, Kish, Shuruppak, and other sites confirm that the Mesopotamian plain experienced major inundation events throughout its history of human occupation. While no single flood horizon corresponds exactly across all sites, suggesting that no universal deluge destroyed all of Mesopotamia simultaneously, the cumulative evidence indicates that severe flooding occurred with sufficient frequency to profoundly shape Mesopotamian culture and religious thought. The global climate catastrophe of the Younger Dryas period, occurring between 10,800 and 9,600 BC, provides additional context for understanding why flood traditions appear across cultures worldwide. This dramatic climate event, possibly triggered by extraterrestrial impact, produced rapid environmental changes and subsequent flooding as ice melted and precipitation patterns shifted. The synchronicity of this global disruption could explain why geographically separated cultures preserve similar flood narratives, each maintaining cultural memories of catastrophic inundation experienced by their ancestors during this pivotal period in human prehistory. The transmission of flood traditions from Sumerian through Akkadian, Babylonian, and eventually Hebrew sources demonstrates the remarkable persistence of cultural memory across political upheavals, language changes, and religious transformations. The essential narrative structure, divine warning, vessel construction, survival through catastrophe, bird testing, mountain landing, sacrifice, and divine reconciliation, remained stable through thousands of years of retelling, while adapting to different theological frameworks and cultural contexts. This stability suggests the narratives addressed fundamental human concerns that transcended particular historical circumstances. The theological sophistication of the Mesopotamian versions, particularly their exploration of divine fallibility, the ethics of mass destruction, and the interdependence of divine and human realms, reveals that ancient Near Eastern thinkers engaged seriously with questions about justice, power, and responsibility that continue to challenge religious and philosophical thought. The debate between Enlil and Ea about proportional punishment versus total destruction articulates principles that would later appear in legal codes and ethical systems throughout the ancient world. As contemporary civilization confronts potential catastrophic disruptions from climate change, pandemic disease, nuclear weapons, and technological risks, the ancient flood narratives offer both warning and hope. They remind us that civilizations, however sophisticated, remain vulnerable to catastrophic collapse from environmental forces or self-inflicted disasters. The gods' regret upon witnessing the flood's intensity serves as cautionary tale about unleashing destructive forces that exceed our capacity to control them. Yet the narratives also demonstrate that survival remains possible through wisdom, preparation, preservation of essential knowledge, and the courage to rebuild after catastrophe. The flood hero's success in preserving not just biological life but also craftsmen, seeds, and the tools of civilization suggests that thoughtful preparation can enable continuity across even the most severe disruptions. In this sense, these 4,000-year-old texts continue to speak to fundamental questions about human survival, cultural continuity, and the possibility of renewal that remain as relevant today as they were when Sumerian scribes first pressed wedge-shaped marks into soft clay tablets in the cities of ancient Mesopotamia.